Good morning, thank you. Miss Moore, good morning.
Good morning, Chair. We start today with evidence from Mr. Castle.
Thank you.
Just repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely and truly, declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Please take a seat.
Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Castle. Can we have your full name, please?
Ian Castle.
And you should have a folder of documents in front of you, and I may refer you to those or show them up on the screen that's in front of you. You've also provided us with 2 witness statements, so the first is at tab 1 and the second's at tab 2. They'll be adduced in full, please. The reference for the first, which was signed on the 4th of November 2021, is INQ 000056. And the second, which you signed on the 1st of February 2022, is HOM 0332049. And what it means by adducing those is we don't have to go through everything that you wrote in them. That's already your evidence. I'm going to ask you about some specific matters that arise from the statements.
Okay.
So first to your role at Brookhouse, particularly during the relevant period. So I understand as to your background, you've been a Home Office employee from 2002 until April 2021.
That's correct.
And now you're with the Department of Education.
I am, yeah.
And your full employment history you've set out at page 2 of your first statement. But in summary, you had roles in immigration, which included charter flights. You had a role in anti-terrorism, then in 2014 in financial crime.
That's right.
And your Brookhouse role began in July 2017. But in fact, you started there in August 2017.
Yes, I was on annual leave for the first couple of weeks.
So as you say at paragraph 8 on page 2, effectively from August 2017 after your leave until April 2021, you were Detention and Escorting Services, so DES, area manager for the Gatwick IRCs, which included Brookhouse.
Yes.
And you had a team of HEOs, so that's Higher Executive Officers.
That's right.
And EOs, Executive Officers, from the Home Office.
That's correct.
And on a day-to-day basis, you say you were responsible for overseeing that team, which monitored contract compliance.
That's correct.
So it's known sometimes as the compliance team.
That's right.
They initially monitored the contract with G4S and then, of course, the contract with Serco when they took over.
That's right.
And we'll be hearing this afternoon from Mr. Paul Gasson. Where did he fit into your team?
So he was the compliance manager, so he was one of the HEOs.
And you were line managed by Michelle Smith, I believe.
That's right, yeah.
I understand this was your first role in immigration detention.
It was, and my first role as a manager.
And your first role as well in contractual compliance?
Indeed.
And you say in your second witness statement at page 10 that you had no training pertinent to the role, and you confirm at paragraph 35 of your first statement, specific contract management training would have been extremely useful.
Yes.
But you didn't have any.
No.
And you say specific, but in fact, did you receive any, even general training on contract compliance?
Not that I recall, no.
What about in assessing service delivery generally?
No. I suppose the closest I might have got would be advice to bone up on the detention service orders.
Okay, so you had, you were advised to look into the legal framework of immigration detention.
Yeah.
And did you have training on that, or were you told to read into them?
No specific training.
So you took it upon yourself to read into the DSOs, having been advised?
Yes, yeah.
And you say at your second witness statement that you do recall getting support from your line manager, but it seems to have been about sort of management style and leadership, so advice on how to manage a team and things like that.
Predominantly, yes.
So going on to the nature of your role, in your first witness statement at paragraph 12, you say there was no formal job specification.
Not that I recall seeing at all.
Did you take over from someone else, or was it a sort of new role?
There had been somebody in post previously. I can't remember the chap's name. I believe he left before I started, so there was no handover or anything like that.
And I understand, as you say, your role included compliance, so attending monthly compliance meetings, is that right?
With the service provider, yes.
Which was G4S at the time when you started. And overseeing, as you said, the work of the rest of the compliance team. And I understand that they would also attend other meetings and produce reports and similar?
Yes, yeah.
In April 2018, you were interviewed by Verita, and we have the notes there. you said that when you joined Brookhouse in August 2017, you'd come from an immigration officer role, and you described it as a double promotion. So was that a significant leap in responsibility?
Yes. So as a immigration officer, that's a EO grade.
Right.
And then the post that I was fortunate enough to get was SEO. So I missed the HEO grade.
I see. And you said it was quite a steep learning curve for me and continues to be so.
Yes, both from management and the actual job itself.
And as we've heard, a learning curve without any real training or instruction given to you, other than that which you took it upon yourself.
Yeah.
You described your role in a nutshell to Verita at page 2 of that transcript as I try to ensure that the contract process is followed and that G4S basically do what they're supposed to do.
In a nutshell, yes.
So in other words, that they fulfil their contractual obligations to the Home Office.
Yes.
And you were asked to comment in your statement about the 2016 HMIP inspection of Brookhouse. So that's a report by HMIP that's dated January 2017, but it relates to events in 2016. And in that report, HMIP had made a number of recommendations directed specifically to the Home Office. Some were about casework, but others were about the physical conditions of Brookhouse, the process for managing detainees at risk of self-harm and suicide, detainees' access to legal advice, welfare checks, activity provision. And you say at paragraph 29 of your first statement that you don't recall seeing the HMIP report before you began your role. Did you know what HMIP was before you started at Brookhouse?
No.
Do you know when you became aware of HMIP?
Probably not long after I started.
Did you know about any kind of scheme of independent oversight of detention centres before you
I
started?
may have had an inkling, shall we say. I assumed that there was some sort of oversight externally.
But you didn't know the specifics?
No.
And the HMIP report that I just mentioned, as well as the conclusions I set out there, also found in 2016 high numbers of detainees feeling suicidal and depressed. It was nearly half of them on arrival. That constant supervision cells were in a poor state and unsuitable for detainees in crisis. Found that there was no effective arrangements to monitor vulnerability over time, despite the long average cumulative period of detention. With hindsight now, but by looking back, do you consider that those issues were relevant to your operational role at Brookhouse?
I suppose that, yes, they could have been certainly given consideration.
Do you recall whether you read the IMB's 2016 report before you started in your role, so the Independent Monitoring Board?
No, I don't recall.
And that report, which you have at your tab 14, found that certain periods of lower staffing levels during that year, so during 2016, had impacted adversely on both staff motivation and on the operation of the centre. And as you, I think, acknowledged in your Verita interview, you said that staffing, since day one, has been an issue, so the first day that you joined, I guess. And at the time of your interview, which, as I said, was April 2018, hadn't shown signs of improving. So in both of your statements, you comment now on staffing levels. I think you say that with more staff, there would be fewer incidents.
Possibly fewer incidents, certainly easier to manage, and would help with the general running of the centre. So if you've got half the staff, half the DCO staff, dealing with an incident, that means there are half the staff missing from the rest of the centre.
So you can't run the activities, things...
Potentially, yes.
Things might move slower in terms of greater waiting times for things like food, maybe?
You also will be missing out on the potential support for the detainees. And you may find that if a DCO is missing from a wing because he is dealing with an incident elsewhere, you may find that there's an incident on that original wing.
Yes, so they could have an effect on not just the kind of day-to-day life, but individual safety issues.
Yes.
And more staff would be safer, so fewer staff is less safe. And is that for both staff and detainees?
Yes.
In summary then, thinking back now to the period when you started at Brookhouse, did you consider that the staffing levels were inadequate?
I did.
And both statements suggest that you never raised thoughts about staffing with your line manager, or anyone indeed. If we looked at your second statement, So behind tab 2, it's page 10. At paragraph 41, you say, I did not raise any concerns regarding staffing levels with my line management chain, as I did not think increasing staff levels was an available option due to contractual and budget constraints. I also believe that they were already aware of the issues, and I assumed that they were part of discussions around staffing levels during monthly and/or quarterly review meetings. It was the responsibility of G4S to deliver the staffing levels required by the contract. My comment regarding staffing levels being dictated by costs was based on a belief that the constraints of the contract meant staffing levels were set. Levels of staff were set. So you say it was the responsibility of G4S to just deliver the staffing levels required by the contract.
Yes,
But it was your responsibility, wasn't it, to monitor the contract?
it was.
And if you were concerned that staffing was not being delivered in line with the contract, was it your job to say so?
Yes, and it was part of discussions. I go back to in August, when I started in August 2017. I obviously wasn't aware of the staffing levels, and my opportunity to discuss them were rather preempted by Panorama. But they were part of discussions ongoing about how G4S might be able to solve this issue, about their recruitment processes, and also if I recall correctly, there was a new contract being discussed. I think the contract with G4S was coming towards an end. So I was aware, although I wasn't party to those discussions, I was aware that staffing levels, well, I believe that staffing levels were being discussed for the new contract.
Who was having those discussions?
That would probably have been commercial and senior managers.
Commercial?
The
Home
Home
Office?
Office commercial team.
Led by Michelle Smith?
No. I can't remember who the manager was, but I used to liaise with a chap called Munir within the Home Office. He was
So-
my sort of equivalent grade within the commercial team.
So your view was that other people were talking about staffing?
Yeah, I was too.
But not with your line manager?
No, we were discussing them, but not necessarily coming to any conclusion.
Just acknowledging that there could be more staff?
Yes.
And as I've read just now from line 41 of your second statement, you said, I did not raise any concerns regarding staffing levels with my line management chain, as I did not think increasing staffing levels was an available option due to contractual and budget constraints. So there might have been contractual and financial reasons why there couldn't be more staff.
Quite possibly.
Can I just ask to show on the screen VER 000268, page 14, please? This is from your interview with Verita that I already mentioned. And 227, thank you. Mr. Marsden, who's one of the interviewers from Verita, asks you, having had this conversation, do you think there are things that the Home Office could do that would get them? Could you apply more pressure? And I don't mean fines, but have you thought about this? Or let's help you fix that problem. You discuss that detention is contentious, and then you say, I honestly think that the Home Office would be prepared to pay or to spend more. So the encouragement from the Home Office will be, you need to consider X and we're prepared to pay for it. Because I think possibly the pushback or the expectations were, who is going to pay for this? By far and away, the most important thing is the staff numbers. So was it your view then, or any time after you started, that the Home Office would have been willing to spend more on staffing?
I think I would be referring here to the new contract, and where the Home Office would be looking to increase numbers within the new contract rather than reviewing the old contract.
So you thought that the Home Office might going forward have more to spend on staffing?
Yes.
But it wasn't part of your role, from what I've understood from what you've suggested, to be part of the discussions around staffing levels, because that was left to commercial.
We did have discussions in our meetings with G4S, and we would discuss their recruitment processes, their turnover, and the such like. I didn't have due to my inexperience within the detention arena, I didn't have any idea of what they might or could do to ensure that the staffing levels were sufficient.
I want to ask about another area of contractual performance then. We can take that, thank you. So staffing is one metric by which you can monitor adherence to the contract, because the contract provides for a certain level of people at different grades. But your team also dealt with other aspects of contractual performance, all of them. The contract, as I understand it, between the Home Office and G4S, although it was initially signed with GSL, is an output contract, so a contract that focuses on the deliverables. The specification requires high-level requirements and G4S undertakes to provide them, rather than being the sort of contract where the way in which those things are delivered is specified with a lot of detail. Yeah. Is that a fair summary of how the contract worked? The total lifetime value of the contract was 137.5 million, and G4S's revenue in 2018, so the first full year that you were involved, was 12.8 million. And I understand that out of that annual revenue, G4S must pay all of its costs, including its subcontract costs. Performance measurement with the contract was by way of monthly self-reporting by G4S of any failures, and that was against 30 performance measurements, and compliance checks were done by the Home Office, so your team. A failure to meet any of those performance measurements can result in a deduction to the monthly fee, and that's either a fixed amount for certain very serious failings or a variable fee calculated on the basis of performance points for less serious failings. So in very brief, every failure reduces the monthly payment from the Home Office to G4S.
That would be correct.
Provided that it's been reported and unless it's been mitigated.
Yes.
Can we have on the screen, please, the NAO report, so DL00000175 at page 28. So this was a report undertaken by the National Audit Office, and it's dated July 2019. Now, if we go to page 28 of that document, this is where you come in, I believe, the figure 12, Home Office oversight of Brookhouse. So there's daily, weekly, monthly and quarterly levels of the oversight provided. Just looking at the weekly entry there. So there's the daily, the on-site compliance team, and we'll be hearing more from them. There's weekly involvement with the on-site compliance team, where they have working level meetings to discuss performance points, possible mitigating circumstances and other issues. Did you attend those weekly meetings, if you can recall?
I may have attended one or two later on, but certainly I wouldn't have thought for the first few months of my career at Brook.
Do you know who from your team, either their name or the level they were at?
That would have been the compliance manager's role, so Paul Gasson and subsequently Simon Murrell.
Sorry, subsequently?
Simon Murrell.
Oh, thank you, yes.
Took over from Paul.
Yeah. And then we see the monthly meetings. So commercial and on-site compliance team attends monthly operational review meetings to discuss performance, finances, action plans and possible changes to the contract. So the meetings might include discussions of possible changes to the contract. Would this be the forum in which to say, for example, we need more staff?
That staffing levels would have been discussed, I'm sure. But I think the changes to the contract would probably be more around the facilities, any changes to the environment, any introduction of new activities that may have had a cost that the Home Office, would consider paying.
And Mr. Gasson, who we'll be hearing from later in his statement to the inquiry, says that weekly meetings would raise issues or failures from both sides, and monthly meetings would include the agreed performance points from the previous month's performance. So at a weekly basis, you look at what happened that week, by the sounds of it, and on a monthly basis, consider the performance points for the whole month.
So I think the monthly basis would be more of an overview. Any issues that had been repeated across the month may be discussed.
And did you have a role either at that meeting or generally in agreeing the performance points which would be applied each month?
They would be, if I recall, from 2017 and 2018, so Paul would sometimes tell me what points had been agreed. And then we would discuss in the monthlies possibly specifics, but as I said, more of a general overview.
An overview, I see. If we look then, rather than talk about in the abstract, at some of the specific performance indicators under the contract. So the same document, but page 36, please. We see here, or we will, yes, a list of the key performance indicators. If we just scroll down a little bit so we can see the whole of 2, thank you. Some with a fixed fine and some with a fine that's based on points, as I mentioned. And the value of those points, I should say, it was variable and rose with inflation. What we have here are the 2019 figures, so we can assume that in 2017 the pounds per points was slightly lower.
I would assume so.
The second entry on the table there, self-harm resulting in death, defined as self-harm of a detainee resulting in their death, involving any failure by G4S to follow procedures for the safety of detainees. And that would have given rise to a fixed penalty of £10,000 per incident. And it would require not just a death, but a death where there was a failure of G4S involved. And similarly, on page 37, and if we look at entry number 10, self-harm resulting in injury, which is defined as self-harm by a detainee requiring any form of healthcare and involving any failure by G4S to follow procedures for the safety of detainees. Now, this is a points-based performance measure. It has a penalty of 400 points per incident, which in 2019 equated to £716, and only where it involved a failure by G4S to follow procedures for the safety of detainees. Those who are involved in compiling the report, so perhaps Mr. Gasson can help us with the detail, but what we see here is that within the monthly performance reports, which we've been provided with, there are no incidents of self-harm which give rise to points deductions. We don't see points applied for self-harm, but then mitigations where G4S have said, no, there was no failure. They're just reported as 0. So, for example, you've been provided with 2017 performance reports, which show 0 untoward events under self-harm resulting in injury. Whereas we have combined reports, which are provided to the IMB, which show that in that same month, there were 8 acts of self-harm by 8 different individuals, 3 requiring treatment on site and 1 requiring treatment off site. So there are in fact 8 acts of self-harm, but none of them are reported. And to be assured that the performance report is accurate in reporting none, you would need, wouldn't you, to be content that none of those acts of self-harm involved a failure by G4S?
Yes.
What steps did you take to ensure that was accurate?
Personally, none.
What about your team?
I don't know. I can't recall. I'm not sure whether I even know. Sorry.
We can ask Mr. Gasson about it, but having heard that and the way that the self-harm, in fact, doesn't always translate to self-harm as a performance measure, to get to that point would involve, wouldn't it, a significant level of trust in the process. So you have to trust that staff will find out about each act of self-harm to record it at all, then that they are properly recorded, and then that there's an accurate account by G4S or someone else of any acts or omissions that might amount to a failure. And you'd recognise, wouldn't you, from a purely financial perspective, that G4S were disincentivised from reporting any contract failures because each one would cost them money.
Yeah.
So it's vital to ensure that despite that, they nevertheless accurately self-report failures.
It is.
And part of that must include a process by which the Home Office can check that they are accurately self-reporting.
I think the problem that we would have there would be if something is not reported, that method is the only way that we have, short of having a member of staff with each of the G4S members of staff walking around to make sure that they're being straightforward and honest, or to review every moment of CCTV and body-worn cameras during a day. So yes, we did rely on honesty and integrity from G4S.
Could you not audit some of the instances, although not all of them? So you don't need to watch every CCTV, but you could pick a day in a month to do so and ensure that the checks that day were correct?
I can't be sure, but I think we did dip sample use of force reports and the such like.
Yep.
But I can't remember, I'm sorry.
So we'll come to the dip sampling of use of force reports, because you do mention that in your statement. But just for now with the self-harm records, during the relevant period, so the 5 months that we've looked at from April to August 2017, combined reports, so the reports that were provided to the IMB, recorded 60 acts of self-harm, so 2 to 3 a week. And I know you started in August 2017, but the same pattern then continued. So looking at August to December, again, 60 acts of self-harm in 5 months. Were you aware of this level of self-harm at Brookhouse?
So, forgive me, because I can't remember, but the reports that were given to the IMB by G4S?
So they're created, they're combined reports. G4S and Home Office agree the figures and provide them to the IMB for the meetings.
Okay. So, can you repeat the question?
Sure.
Sorry.
So during the relevant period, the data that we have, which is from those reports as well as elsewhere, shows that during the period that we're looking at, there were 60 acts of self-harm over 5 months.
Okay.
And I just, because you weren't there for the whole of the relevant period, said by way of illustration, from August to December, the same sort of pattern continued. So again, 60 acts of self-harm. And I wondered whether you were aware of the level of self-harm being similar at Brookhouse.
I can't remember. I suppose even if I did, I wouldn't have a comparator. Because 60 episodes of self-harm could be a reduction. It could have been 120 the year before. I don't know. So I can't say whether I was aware that it was good or bad, or at what level was good.
Well, presumably the level which is good is none.
Yes.
Because what we have in the performance points that were reported to and by your team is no performance points deductions for self-harm throughout April and going on till I think we have November 2017.
Okay. So no reports at all?
None that were reported under this scheme that only requires reporting of self-harm resulting in injury where there's a failure by G4S.
Were any mitigated? Sorry, I shouldn't be asking you questions.
No, that's fine. No mitigations, zero reporting at all.
I've got no explanation for that.
If you'd have known that the level of self-harm was 2 or 3 a week and that there'd never been, during that period, any performance points under Measure 10 reported to you, would you have seen that as an anomaly?
Probably.
But as far as you know, that information hadn't occurred to you or been provided to you?
I don't remember. Sorry.
And by the time that you left, so in April 2021, Serco had taken over the contract.
That's correct, yeah.
And I understand that it was quite a similar contract, so outcome focused and requiring a level of self-performance of failures.
Yeah.
And had you taken any steps by the time that you left to ensure that failures such as these were being adequately reported? Presumably not the 24-hour, we'd have to check all the CCTV that you described.
Not that I remember.
I want to ask a quick question about a comment that's made by Peter Needon of G4S now. He tells us that the Home Office operated a red, amber, green rating system across all its contracts. And I wondered, were you aware of a RAG or a red, amber, green system?
In what context?
So he said across all of the Home Office contracts, including Brookhouse, there was a red, amber, green rating system applied. Did you know of a red, amber, green system? We can ask the other contractual and commercial managers of that. So turning now to your knowledge of Brookhouse generally, I think you told Verita that you'd have an occasional walk around the centre.
Yeah.
And obviously you spent your time between the 3 Gatwick sites.
Yeah, so there's 2 buildings,
Yeah.
Brookhouse, and then
Tinsley.
at Tinsley House we have an IRC and family accommodation.
And you'd spend some time in the office, presumably, so occasionally you'd go for a walk around.
Yeah, in both, yeah.
And you told Verita that would be once every couple of weeks. It depends. I might go a couple of weeks and not see anywhere, and then I might do 2 or 3 trips in a week. You said I don't go across the whole centre, but I would imagine that quite a few of the detainees would recognise me. But my experience of staff interaction with the detainees is, from what I've seen, okay. And you say I haven't seen anyone be disrespectful. Now, Paul Kempster, who's the Chief Operating Officer for G4S, has made a comment to Verita. He's talking about the SMT rather than about the Home Office, but I just want to ask you about the point he makes. He considers that if you walk around a centre, you get a feel for it. You see how people interact with each other and with the detainees, the language they use, never mind the violence, but just dismissive language and swearing and the fact that they're doing it openly. And he mentions other people doing it off camera as well. So while he's talking about the SMT and the impressions they can get from brief visits around the centre.
So G4S, SMT?
That's right, yeah. He's talking about the G4S, but the point generally he's making is that by walking around a centre, you can get a feel for the culture and for example, whether there's bad language or disrespectful language being used to detainees. Did you feel like in your walks around Brookhouse you had an adequate feel for what the centre was like?
So I probably didn't walk round for the first few weeks.
Yeah.
And of course, then we had Panorama. So on my walks round Brook, I can put my hand on my heart and say I never saw anyone either being rude or disrespectful to any of the men that were in our care.
Did you think it was important for you to have an experience of what it was like on the ground at the centre, day to day?
It was important to me. I'm not sure that it had an impact on my job, but I felt like I needed to be out there, talk to the men, talk to the staff, to get a feel of what it was like.
So you say it was important to me, but you're not sure that it would be a necessary part of the job description, maybe?
Well, yeah, I mean, I enjoyed the interaction with the men, and it was something that I'd missed from my previous jobs that were very operational.
Yeah.
So it was something I sort of enjoyed doing.
Yep.
As well.
But it's important, I'd suggest also, isn't it, for the role, because without a feel for how the centre's working, you're managing the contract in a bit of an abstract. You don't know what the effects of the provisions that you're giving force to are.
Yeah, to be honest, it's not something I've considered. I've not given it that much thought about the reasons why I felt the need to go out there, and somebody else may have a different point of view. I can only speak from the way I was thinking.
I want to turn to a different topic, and this is use of force, which we've already very briefly touched on when you mentioned the dip sample. So, in your first witness statement at paragraphs 41 to 44, it's page 9, you discuss use of force. And you say this is something you looked at once the team's working methods were changed around. So I understand that there was a period where different people in your team were sort of designated different roles in a different way. And that was obviously after Panorama. So I think it was sometime in 2018, which we'll come to. So you started to look at use of force, and you say at paragraph 42, you did dip sample use of force reports, and you've already mentioned that.
Yeah, from what I recall.
And you say at 43, though, that you never saw any use of force in real or in footage.
No.
So
but that's correct, yes.
Yeah, so you dip sampled the documents, but you weren't present.
Not personally, but my team.
Your team did. Do you know who in your team it was?
May have been Jenny Vandenberg.
Okay. So without seeing the incident in person or footage of the incident, would you agree that you don't know if, or you or whoever in your team is doing the sampling, you don't know if everyone involved in the incident has completed a form? Because you don't know who's involved?
No,
You don't know if the description of force which is recorded on the form is accurate?
that's correct.
You don't know if the rationale that's recorded on the form for using force is in fact the true build-up of what happened?
Yeah, you could say that. Yeah.
You don't know whether force was used as a last resort?
Well, if you're watching a video, you can see, you would hopefully see the process that has been followed, or the escalation or de-escalation of the incident, and the steps that the DCOs may have taken to try to de-escalate the incident.
Yes, but you say at paragraph 43 that you didn't watch footage to do the dip sampling.
Me personally,
Oh, so somebody in your team who did the dip sampling did watch footage, is that right?
yeah, I'm fairly certain we did.
And do you know when that began?
I think it would probably been early 2018. It might have been before that. I don't know whether it was occurring prior to my arrival, but I'm pretty certain we started to do it. It was in place end of 2017, early 2018.
And do you know what percentage of use of force incidents would be subject to the dip
I
sample?
can't remember, sorry.
But nevertheless, that you didn't personally do it and you don't know how many were reviewed. Did you consider this an adequate measure to ensure that use of force was being used appropriately, or did you not consider that part of your contractual role?
I didn't really consider it, full stop.
And finally, on use of force, the Verita report, the actual report, not your interview to them, recorded at paragraph 12.67, the interim director told us that in late 2017 he had received approval from on-site Home Office managers for 20 officers without an up-to-date training in CNR to continue to work at Brookhouse for periods of up to a month. That approval was subsequently withdrawn. Do you know who the on-site Home Office managers referred to there are who would have been approving officers?
That would probably have been Paul, but as far as certification was concerned, we would go to another department.
Which department?
I can't remember the formal name, but there was a small team that dealt with certification, clearance, and the such like. So I'm pretty certain we would have gone to them to ask if it was acceptable to use staff that were, to use the colloquialism, out of ticket.
And you say it was probably Paul. May it have been you who approved the?
It is
officers?
possible, but I don't remember.
Okay, fine. And if you had gone to the small team, would you conduct any of your own sort of checks to ensure that it was appropriate, or would you follow whatever the team told you?
I would probably have suggested, can we do this? Is there any reason why we can't do this? So there may have been some legislation that either would empower us to take that decision, or indeed not allow us to use staff that were out of ticket.
But it's quite obvious why you use staff that have up-to-date training, isn't it? Safety reasons?
Yes, yeah, of course. The preference would be for staff to... But the other consideration, and this is something that has just occurred to me, but for someone to be in ticket one day and then out of ticket the next does not necessarily mean that they are completely incapable of carrying out those duties.
So you consider there might be a area of leeway, perhaps?
I don't like the word leeway.
Sure.
But
subject to approval.
Yeah, and sometimes it's about the risk. Again, this was agreed by the certification team.
And as we see in the Verity report, the approval was subsequently withdrawn. Do you remember being told why it was withdrawn?
No, I don't remember the sort of ins and outs of that process.
Moving on now then to Rule 40, you say in your second statement at paragraph 25 about Rule 40 and 42, and you said that you let yourself know about DSOs when you started, and obviously once you started working at Brookhouse, you would have heard about Rule 40 and learned more about it, I assume.
It was one of the first things that I was sort of made aware of, as far as my authority as a SEO was required.
Yeah. You say you didn't review Rule 40 to 42 paperwork for quality purposes, but that a member of staff dip sampled the paperwork. And then you say, I did have sight of the paperwork if I was required to authorise an extension. So that's the authority you mentioned.
Yes,
And you don't recall any specific times you directly engaged with detainees during the Rule 40 to 42, and you definitely did not do so during the relevant period.
I may have clarified that in my second statement. I do recall a couple of times in the 4 years I was there that I did interact with the men in their rooms.
Right.
During the review.
And you say not during the relevant period. Obviously, that was only for you.
Absolutely
4 weeks that you were working there. Do you recall roughly how often you would be asked to authorise an extension to a Rule 40?
It really could vary. There may have been occasions where we would have had 4 or 5 Rule 40 stroke 42s going on at the same time, and there were plenty of times where there was nobody held under Rule 40.
So if there's 4 or 5 on at the same time, you have to authorise every day, is that right?
I would authorise for a period.
Right.
Up to 2 weeks, which I never did. I can't say never. I don't recall authorising a full 2 week detention under Rule 40. Subsequent to the 2 week period, the process is refreshed and would go up to my grade 7, Michelle, to authorise further detention under Rule 40. The expectation from me and the team, my team, was that G4S would continue to de-escalate the detainee. So if I'd authorised, for example, a further 3 days, they were welcome to actually release the man earlier. It was a limit. So
you'd authorise for what you thought the maximum appropriate amount of time is, with the inbuilt safeguard that G4S might release sooner?
Yes.
How did you know whether extension should be authorised if you weren't, as you say, very regularly in contact with the detained person? So what would you look at?
I would get a report, a formal document, part of the part of the DSO, which would outline the reasons for the original detention under Rule 40 and steps that have been taken, incidents that may have occurred, an overview of what had happened during the review, and a member of my staff would have been present.
So who created that formal document?
that was sent to me. That's a G4S would write the document.
And you said it would include what was Rule 40 logs, where you say your member of staff was present.
So the review would take place with G4S, health. I think a member of healthcare, chaplaincy, and Home Office staff.
Yes. So daily visits, as we know, to anyone on Rule 40 or 42 are required by a grade EO or higher.
That's right.
Per the DSO. So that would that be a member of your team who would be going to the daily Rule 40s?
Yes.
And was it your job to ensure that a member of your team went to see anyone on Rule 40 or 42 every day?
I suppose so, but it's an expectation. If we had someone on Rule 40, a member of staff would be going down.
And when you took the decision to extend, you'd look at your the formal document, which was a composite of Rule 40 logs?
Yeah.
Do you remember what other information, if any, would be in there?
So there would be the initial reason, and then depending on the day, how many days that the detainee had been held under Rule 40, there would be a summary of each. There would be a summary of each day. So it would be a rolling document. So they would add if I'd authorised a further 24 hours, I'd get the same document with then a further summary of how the previous 24 hours and that review had occurred.
Yep. And would you speak to the member of staff who visited them, or normally rely on the written record?
What would normally happen would be the member of staff would come up and say, I think we're going to either extend and give me reasons, or I think he's they're going to let him back on the wing. So I didn't have to authorise him being released. I just had to authorise the extension if it was required. And
were there times, if you can remember, when there was a suggestion that he be maintained on Rule 40, but you thought, actually, no, I shouldn't grant this authorisation?
I'm sure there were occasions when I'd asked for more detail. And I'm sure there were occasions when I asked them to look at any additional methods or ways of de-escalating and getting the fella off Rule 40 and back into normal association. So, as I think everyone's aware, the CSU is at the end of Ewing. So, a possibility of de-escalation would be to move him to Ewing, for example.
And approximately how often or what percentage of times when you were asked for authorisation did you ask for more information before you granted it? Is it unusual, regular?
Not regular, no, irregularly.
And what percentage of times, if at all, did you, even despite any more information, say, no, I'm not going to grant this authorisation?
This may be a false memory, but I think I did once or twice.
And rather than looking at your decision now, how often, if at all, did members of your team say, I don't think that we should grant the authorisation?
Again, irregularly.
So on a day-to-day basis, you'd normally grant the authorisations, although sometimes you might ask for more information.
Generally.
The IMB in 2016 and 2017, and we've already mentioned the IMB's reports for those years, expressed concerns about mentally unwell detainees being held on Rule 40 in the CSU. You mentioned the Care and Separation Unit. And we've now heard during the course of the inquiry, including from Sandra Culver, the head of healthcare, I don't know if you saw her evidence, that Rules 40 and 42 were sometimes used on detainees with mental illnesses or who were self-harming or who had suicide risks. You say in your second statement at paragraph 25 that you didn't notice a pattern of detainees with mental health issues being held on Rule 40.
No, not a pattern.
You did notice it happening.
I'm sure that there would have been probably a number of occasions where the men would have been suffering from mental health issues. I think if you spend more than 24 hours in Brookhouse, you're going to develop mental health issues. It's not a nice place to be.
And there's people who you suggest exacerbated by being in Brookhouse?
Possibly.
And there's people also who have them in any event, aren't there?
Yeah.
And some of those were on Rule 40.
Yeah.
Did you ever consider that being on CSU was itself a further exacerbation?
The issue around Rule 40 is not just, it's not a punishment.
Yeah.
It's to keep that person safe and secure. Mm-hmm. It's to stop them self-harming. It's also for the safety and security of the other residents and also of the staff. So in the round, you would have to consider the safety of the other men mm-hmm. and the staff and the detainee himself.
It's obviously, as you say, it's not a punishment and it might keep them safe and secure. But for some people, I know you're not a clinician, but being held in self-isolation under Rule 40 doesn't help their condition?
As you said, I'm not a clinician, and I'm sure that some people with mental health issues would welcome the peace and quiet. Brook is a loud place, so they would possibly welcome. But again, I'm no clinician.
Sure. So you say that when you said that you didn't notice a pattern of detainees with mental health issues being held on Rule 40, we shouldn't be confused by the word pattern. You did notice it happening. You just didn't notice any specific pattern to it.
Yeah.
I see. And by the time that you left, which was in 2021, were you aware that more IMB reports, so from 2017 and 2018, had raised concerns regarding mentally unwell detainees being held on Rule 40?
So I would have probably been aware, I can't remember specifics, but I would have been aware of the issues that the IMB had raised, mm-hmm. Because we would send them a response. But without seeing a specific report that came under my time at Brook and seeing our response, I can't really say.
So the IMB report regarding 2020 that I mentioned earlier, although it was published after you left the role, so you wouldn't have seen it. It was published, I think, the month after you left. But it flagged concerns also around the preemptive use of Rule 40. Was that something that you ever had concerns about?
No. I'm sure it must have happened, but mm-hmm. I don't recall any specifics around being... personally being asked to authorise a preemptive Rule 40.
And as I mentioned about the IMB concerns about mentally unwell detainees on Rule 40, obviously you were responsible sometimes for authorising Rule 40 extensions. Did consideration of the mental impact of being on Rule 40 play into your decision of whether or not to authorise? I
am sure that I would have requested, if it hadn't been mentioned by G4S, mm-hmm. That the man would be referred to mental health, talk to the mental health nurse. So, yes, it was a consideration.
And you discuss at paragraphs 18 to 19 of your first witness statement the adults at risk policy.
Yes.
Did you receive training on that policy?
No.
And the Rule 40 to 40 DSO, which you have considered, specifies that you should consider the Rule 40 to 40 DSO alongside the management of adults at risk when making immigration decisions and decisions like Rule 14 immigration detention. Mm-hmm. Would you consider that the question of whether someone is an adult at risk, according to the wording of the policy, was relevant to your decisions about whether or not to extend Rule 40?
The issues around the health, both mental and physical, of the detainee was considered along with the security of the centre and the other detainees and the staff. So it was, yes, it was considered.
But you didn't have any training, I think you indicated, on adults at
Yeah,
risk.
I can't say that I was aware that the adults at risk policy would sit alongside, that the two of them would sit alongside each other.
Okay. I want to move on now to the division of responsibility in your team, just briefly. So you state in your second witness statement, paragraph 26, that in late 2017 or 2018, contract compliance changed, and thereafter different staff were given different aspects of the contract to look at. Is that right?
Yeah.
And the Nao report, which we briefly looked at, says that before 2018, the Home Office on-site team at Brookhouse focused almost exclusively on supporting Home Office immigration casework teams in their interactions. And it says that one executive officer spent part of their time overseeing the contract. It says that it was not able to sufficiently examine other areas of self-reported performance or challenge G4S on its management of the centre. And then at 3.4, it says, following the Stephen Shaw review, the Home Office decided to improve its management of its on-site operations, including strengthening its detainee engagement team. And in parallel, following the National Audit Office recommendations, the Home Office decided to improve its monitoring of the contract. In April 2018, it split its on-site team into a detainee engagement team supporting detainees' immigration casework and a contract compliance team. That's your team, isn't it? And the compliance team now comprises 4 executive officers, 1 higher executive officer and 1 senior executive officer, led by a grade 7 official, i.e. a civil service middle manager. Is that the same event that you refer to where different staff were given different aspects of the contract to comply? And are you the grade 7 official mentioned? No, sorry, you're the senior
Michelle
executive
Smith
officer,
would be
of
the-
course. And Michelle Smith is the grade 7. At that point, so at the point where the nature of the monitoring changed a bit, did you receive then any training on contractual performance monitoring?
No.
You say in your statement that you felt that this improved your team's effectiveness, and you discussed this sort of thematic approach to the contract with Verita. You were asked, how does it divide up? And you said, we can't cover X amount of staff, and there are Y numbers of pointers within the contract, but we have covered what we feel are most essential. For example, Jenny with security will have a look around the centre, have a chat with some of the staff. She is reviewing, for example, the Rule 4042 paperwork and how it's dealt with. And then you say food testing and cleaning will be dealt with on a daily basis.
Yeah.
So you couldn't cover every pointer, but you've covered what you feel is most essential.
Yeah, so the reception, welfare, and I think activities went under welfare, catering and cleaning, and security. So to ensure that that we are looking at reports, use of force reports and such like.
Was that your assessment of what was most essential, or did it come from somebody else or some other department?
It was driven by Michelle.
Yep. Fine. So areas to concentrate on within.
Yeah, I think she had the initial idea, and we had a couple of meetings as a team to discuss more specifics and who would deal with each particular area.
Yep. And you say that you felt that made your monitoring more effective.
I think so. Yeah.
Turning now to your experience of the aftermath of Panorama. So obviously you were pretty newly arrived when it was broadcast, so almost everything that you saw at the centre was the aftermath of Panorama. In your first statement, you say at paragraph 47 that during your time at Brookhouse, you had no reason to think that the behaviour the programme showed was continuing. And at paragraph 50, you say that following the programme, an action plan was put into place with numerous improvements and changes.
Yeah.
Could we have a look again at Verita, so VER 000268, and it'll come up on the screen again. If we can look at page 5. So again, this is the transcript of your interview with Verita, which occurred on the 23rd of April 2018, so about 7.5 months after the broadcast. Page 5. And sort of top half of the page, please. So you'd been asked there quite a long question about things that have changed in relation to the fallout from Panorama. And you say at 46, there is quite a lot of talk, and you're talking there about senior managers having previous experience in prisons. And you say at 52, just for clarity, it's not just Steve. Lee comes from a prison background where he has worked in detention centres. Previously, he worked here a few years ago, so there seems to have been a lot of references to how they deal with in prisons. And I have said, this isn't a prison, this is a detention centre, and things are different. They don't seem to be able to take that on board. So just pausing there, Steve and Lee, is that Steve Skitt, Deputy Director at the time, and Lee Hamford, Director after Ben Saunders left?
Yeah.
Okay, going on. You say, I must say, I was quite impressed with Lee when he came in, but a lot of the work they have done has been very superficial. A lick of paint here, a few new tiles there, but I think he does care about, certainly, the safety of the detainees. Whether he has access to the purse strings to do anything about it, I don't know. And then Mr. Marsden asks you, do you feel that some of the stuff that's happened since Panorama is all well and good, but it's not really getting to the nub of the issue? And you say, to a certain degree, yes. Superficial improvements in the look of the place are one thing, like I said. Having a fresh lick of paint in the main corridors, okay, that's all right. So just pausing there, you thought that Lee Hamford did care about the safety of detainees, but you didn't know if he had access to the purse strings to do anything more concrete.
Yeah, and I remember having a conversation with Lee about putting in a whole new gym facility over one of the or in one of the yards, and enclosing one of the yards. But it was going to cost an awful lot of money.
And is that having something built into the contractual arrangement to allow money for things that should or could be done? Is that something that you had a role in understanding, promoting?
Yes, yeah, to a certain degree, depending on the costs. Bringing in some new computer games, for example, would be something that that I would be able to authorise. But big spends would have to go to a senior manager and probably across the commercial team as well.
Yep. So if you thought there was a big spend, as you call it, that would require a more fundamental change to the contract, you couldn't authorise it yourself, but you could raise it with somebody else.
Yeah, I think it's worth bearing in mind as well that at this time there was still the issue of the contract, the changeover of the contract, which I possibly didn't think about when I was interviewed.
How do you mean?
So I didn't consider the fact that there's going to be a new contract in place. So hopefully this, I don't have any control over what will become of the new contract. I was asked a question and I gave an opinion.
Okay, so you don't have any control over what's in the new contract. Did you feel that, given your knowledge that you'd accrued over the last 7.5 months of working there, 8 months, you had useful feedback to give into what should be in the new contract?
Possibly, but actually 7.5 months isn't an enormously long time, especially in an environment like Brookhouse and in the job I had. So it was almost like a never-ending learning process.
Yeah, but you'd noticed things, hadn't you, by this time about staffing being an issue, for example?
Yes.
And some activities points you just made. Did you feed these back to anyone who might have had responsibility for drawing up the new contract?
Not the extension, because we were going through an extension process. But for the new contract, which came into place in 2020,
with Serco,
I was part of the team that had a look at what we needed on the Gatwick IRCs.
So was your understanding that the extension process was simply extending the same contract without a provision to change any of the requirements?
I think so, yeah.
And then at the bottom of that page, you're asked about governance and what's being done to ensure people are looked after. We can see that in the last question. And just to turn over the page to page 6, at the top it's suggested to you that there's a lot of meetings The questioner we can see mentions we've been to adults at risk meetings, we've been to a security meeting, we've been to a detainee of interest meeting, and they suggest that there's an awful lot of meetings and talking, and the person who's asking you questions isn't sure that it achieves everything. And they say, does that ring true for you in a lot of those meetings? And you say, it does. There is a lot of waffle and a lot of hot air. The questioner says a lot of gossip, and you say yes, but not much in the way of action. I have to agree with you. Kate is the name of the person asking you questions. And going back to page 3, and this is in response to a question at the bottom of page 2 about contract monitoring and whether the target monitoring lacked a bigger picture approach to quality of life. At the top of page 3 there, you're asked, in overall terms, how are they doing at the moment? This is G4S. If 10 was a brilliant job and 1 was not very good at all, where would you put them? And then they acknowledge you're relatively new in the relationship, but your answer's there at 15. You say, no, I see and hear words and I see attempts, but they are hugely hindered by the recruitment process and by the pool of people that they have available. And I think it is not the beginning and end of everything, but it's a huge contributing factor to everything they do and don't do here. I probably couldn't give them more than 6. So you've given them a 6 out of 10, and you've mentioned that there's, at these meetings, a lot of things being said, but not much action.
Yeah, and I think also I mentioned there that they were hindered by the recruitment process.
Yeah, so that's a staffing.
Yeah, and it didn't help them being right next to Gatwick Airport, where the salaries, I was led to believe, were better.
I see. So they're competing with someone who can pay more.
Yeah, their catchment area. I think they had staff who were coming up from the coast and not beyond the coast, but further away, sort of north of London.
Yep.
People with long journeys.
I see. So one of the issues might be that there were more attractive salaries locally, similar jobs.
Yeah.
Maybe easier.
I think so.
Did you find the salaries of DCO was a contractual issue you might have had some feedback into?
Don't remember discussions around the salaries.
Okay. Do you think that if we looked at your team's performance monitoring documents, so the monthly reports that we see, and the points that your team would have raised in various contract review meetings, we'd have known that stepping back and looking at the big picture at this time, you'd only rate G4S a 6 out of 10? Do you think that would have come through?
I don't know, because I'm basing my 6 on stuff that isn't measured. So, for example, the hot air and lack of action is not something that's measured. It's not something that's part of the contract. So I can't say. Probably not.
And your criticism of some of the meetings where things are discussed but not much was really done to make effective change, would you accept that that was true of some of the contractual compliance meetings involving your team as well?
I don't think so. I don't suppose you could give me an example, could you?
So, for example, in your team's meetings where you're monitoring the contract, you've discussed the performance points, but not much, maybe is delved into in a lot of detail and not much change arises. Would that be true for some of your meetings?
Possibly in some respects, I suppose. But I can't give a definitive, I'm sorry.
So we talked, for example, about the monitoring of self-harm and the fact that you don't seem to have been aware at the actual levels of self-harm versus what ended up being recorded in your reports.
Yeah.
Would you accept that was an example?
Would probably be an issue, yes.
Finally, then, turning to the situation at the time that you left, I've already mentioned the IMB report that you have at tab 18. Now, it wasn't published, as I said, until after you left, so there's no expectation you'll have seen or applied it, but its contents are about 2020, so the last year you were there. And by 2020, there was a new contract, so a contract with Serco. Obviously, there was the significant impact of the pandemic, and as a result of the changes in charter flights accordingly, under the Dublin Convention Charter Programme, the majority of the population at Brookhouse had crossed the channel via
We had
boats.
a lot of small boat people.
Can we have a look at IMB 000202, please, and page 5 of that? So this is from that report. So page 5 and the 4th bullet point there. So the 4th bullet point says that the combination of the compressed nature of the charter flight programme with Brookhouse as its sole base for Dublin Convention flights and the fundamental changes in the centre's population and nationalities, the different vulnerabilities and their needs, put the centre's systems, detainees and staff under great stress and raised some serious concerns for the board, so that's the Independent Monitoring Board. Mm-hmm. Most notably, there was a dramatic increase in levels of self-harm and suicidal ideation, deficiencies in the induction process, and an increased need for legal support and detention centre Rule 35 assessments. At the bottom of the page, under the heading "How Safe is the IRC?", the board's view is that due to circumstances related to the Dublin Convention Charter Programme, in the latter months of 2020, Brookhouse was not a safe place for vulnerable detainees who had crossed the Channel in small boats. And it says that this is evidenced by the high levels of self-harm and suicidal ideation at this time. And we've seen elsewhere in this document that the high levels of self-harm drove up the use of force. And finally, over leaf at the top of page 6, under the heading "How fairly and humanely are detainees treated?", from our monitoring and observations, the board's view is that detainees are generally treated humanely at Brookhouse. However, the board's view is that circumstances in Brookhouse related to the Dublin Convention Charter Programme amounted to inhumane treatment of the whole detainee population by the Home Office in the latter months of 2020. This is obviously very concerning to read. It shows, doesn't it, that despite changes made in light of Panorama to improve detainee welfare at Brookhouse, some of which you've alluded to, systems at Brookhouse were not sufficiently robust to safeguard vulnerable detainees at this time.
Possibly, and the processes because of COVID.
Mm-hmm.
That was a hugely impacting factor as well. And I can't disagree with a word that the IMB have said.
And in your view, you've mentioned the impact of COVID, of course, but in your view, where else does the responsibility for this lie?
That's a political question, I think, and I'm not sure that I'm in a position to answer it as a Home Office employee.
Well, you have a knowledge of the operation of the contract at Brookhouse, for example?
Yeah.
In your view, is there any operational issues that you saw during your time there that would have contributed to this?
From the period after lockdown until pretty much I left was a hugely stressful time for the staff, for the DCOs and for the detainees. There were a lot of staff going off, not so much on my team, but there was the effects of stress were affecting our senior managers. Our grade 6 went off,
Yeah.
and the Director General actually went off with sick, so with stress. So we were there to do a job to the best of our ability, as were the Serco staff at the time, with some fairly difficult restraints. So I think the best was made of an incredibly bad job.
Difficult, do you mean constraints?
The political drive to remove people who cross the Channel in the small boats was difficult to keep up with.
Chair, I don't have any further questions for Mr Castle. The Chair may have some questions for you now.
Thank you, Ms Moore. Mr Castle, I just have two brief questions for you. The first is in relation to, you talked about, Ms Moore asked you some questions about Rule 40, Rule 42 and the interface with the adults at risk policy. Did you or anybody in your team ever have any training more broadly relating to mental health and any of the issues that are contained within the DSOs?
No, the only training that we may have received, I don't remember receiving any, but possibly Jenny as the sort of DCO, no, sorry, I'm getting myself confused here. As the Rule 40 expert, she may well have had some training around what the expectation of the quality of the document that was presented to us by G4S.
But you can't remember anything specific?
No, I'm sorry.
That's fine. No, I don't want you to speculate. It's just if you can remember. Thank you. The other question I have is with regard to the performance indicators around where there were going to be penalties following self-harm incidents. Obviously, Ms Moore has explained that there were none of those reported, and so I realise that what I'm asking you is potentially a theoretical question. But we've seen through some of the documents that Ms Moore showed you that the penalties would only apply if a G4S failure had contributed to the self-harm.
Yep.
How would the decision be made about whether there had been a failure on G4S's part? Would the Home Office make that decision? Would G4S make that decision?
So these were made at meetings with Paul Gassel and Simon Murrell, the compliance managers. But I would imagine, if I recall correctly, G4S would present a list of failures with the mitigation at the side, and Paul and or Simon would have asked them for more information. But I wasn't at those meetings. But I would be pretty confident that they would ask for any sort of clarity, or evidence as well. They wouldn't just accept their word for it. Excuse me. They would be looking at evidence too.
Okay, perhaps a question for Mr Gasson then, from what you're telling me.
Possibly, yes.
Okay,
I'm
thank
sure
you.
he'll be able to help.
I have no other questions for you, Mr Castle. Thank you very much for coming this morning. I know it's not a very easy experience, but it's been important to hear from you, so thank you.
Thank you.
Ms Moore?
Yes, thank you, Chair. We have Lee Hanford after the break. It's 11:20 now, so if we take a 20-minute break until 11:40.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr Castle. Thank you very much. Ms Townsend, thank you.
Swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the
and
truth.
nothing but the truth.
Please take a seat, Mr Hansford. Thank you.
Good morning,
Good
Chair.
morning.
We'll now be hearing from Lee Hanford.
Thank you.
Mr Hanford, please could you give your full name to the inquiry?
Lee Hanford.
And is it correct that you have provided a witness statement to this inquiry? And the reference, Chair, is CJS 0074048.
That's correct.
Chair, I'd ask for this statement to be adduced, please.
Thank you indeed.
Ms Hanford, I first want to ask you about your roles in and around the relevant period at G4S and Brookhouse. You provided a helpful overview in your witness statements, paragraphs 4 to 7. I won't ask you to look for them now. But essentially, you've been employed at G4S Care and Rehabilitation Services since around April 2004. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And from 2006 to 2011, you were the Business Development and Bid Manager, which meant you managed bids for new prison contracts for G4S.
Correct.
Then between 2011 and April 2014, you were the Business Development and Mobilisation Transition and Transformation Director. And this involved mobilisation of operational contracts following successful bids.
Yeah, that's correct.
And then, between April 2014 and 2016, you were the Operational Development Director. Before I get to the secondment that you took within that period, can you explain what is an Operational Development Director in layman's speak?
In layman's speak, it was supporting the managing director of the organisation, overseeing sort of operational activities across the wider Ken Justice Estate, really, looking after our prisons and immigration centres.
And in terms of just before the relevant period, you were seconded as the Interim Director of Gatwick IRCs between February and June 2016.
That's correct.
And within that role, you had responsibility for the management of Brookhouse, Tinsley House and Cedars, whilst the Director, Ben Saunders, was seconded to Medway.
Yes.
During the relevant period, you were a Business Change Director from 2016 to 2019. Again, can you explain in layman's terms what a Business Change Director means?
Generally, that was when we had some issues that arose from activities across other sites, whether it be managing recommendations and overseeing the recommendations from observers such as the IMB, Hmip, etc., engaging with the on-site contract directors to ensure that they were delivering in accordance with the relevant action plans.
And during that period again, you were seconded as, again, Interim Director for a second period of Gatwick IRCs following the airing of Panorama.
That's correct.
So that was between September 2007 to September 2008.
18, yes.
2017 and 2018. After that period, you became Operational Support Director and then more recently from February 2021, the Chief Operating Director for G4S Care and Rehabilitation Services. I want to ask you about your role as a Gold Commander, because you've been a Gold Commander throughout this period, or at least from 2011. Can you explain what a Gold Commander's role is?
The Gold Commander's activities are that you're alerted when there may be a serious incident at a particular establishment, and you, in terms of, we'll have our own G4S Gold Command structure, Home Office within the IRC estate will have their own Gold Command structure, and HMPPS would have their Gold Command structure. We would maintain a relationship as a tripartite relationship between the on-site Silver Commander with the relevant Gold Commander, whether that be HMPPS or the IRC in this instance, and the G4S Gold Commander.
So in terms of what you'd be doing day to day as a Gold Commander, is it right that you would have responsibility for the management of serious incidents that came up within a centre, with one of those three centres?
Only serious incidents that occurred which required the incident command suite to be opened.
Indeed. And would one of those serious incidents be when a detained person was on the netting, on the suicide netting?
Not necessarily. Only depends on the time of that of their period on the netting. So if it's there for an extended period, then yes, you would be called upon. And again, only if the command suite had been opened in the local facility.
And was there more than one goal commander acting at any one time, or was there just one for example, Brookhouse?
For Brook, well, for our own business across Chief West, there was one goal commander at any one time supporting all of our contracts, and that would be on a rolling programme. Sort of, there were three of us sharing the rolling programme of goal command.
And was one of the other goal commanders Jerry Petherwick?
He was.
Do you remember any times within the relevant period, so in 2017, April to August, where you were the goal commander when there was a serious incident which required you to act?
Yes, I think it was within the relevant period. There was an issue on the yard with a number of detainees. There was some intelligence to suggest they may protest and go on the yard, which we'd experienced over a number of times over the years. And I think if we are talking about the same incident as when Sarah Newland was the deputy director on call, and she'd engaged with me to advise what was occurring. My advice to her was to return back to the establishment, open the command suite, and we'd engage.
And what was the result of that? What happened?
It was a peaceful resolution, and it was. I think by the time I'd got back to become desk-bound, the incident had been resolved.
Were you ever involved in managing incidents on the netting?
At Brookhouse, no. Oh, not in this period. In 2016, I was. Yeah, sorry.
And during those incidents, is it right that generally the National Tactical Response Group, the NTRG, is called to manage those incidents?
No, only if it's a prolonged incident. So very often we would engage and negotiate, because very often it would be quite short term, 25, 30 minutes. When we encroach into longer periods of time, then we would engage with to seek mutual aid and national resource, because we can't intervene at height. That has to be from the national team.
And in that experience that you've just said in 2016, were the NTRG called?
No.
And when you said they have to be called when they're for a long period, why do they have to be?
If I can correct, the reason I was involved in 2016, not as goal commander, it was during my time as the director at
Yes.
Brookhouse, but we didn't open the command suite on that occasion, sorry.
So the NTRG were not called?
Not on that 2016.
And what crosses the threshold of when the NTRG is called?
Very often time, and when you're negotiating and you're not building up that rapport with an individual, at that point in time, then it needs some resolution, because you're going to have to at some point get back to a normal regime. We've all seen instances when it's escalated from a netting to major disturbances. So time is the critical factor, and time when those aren't engaging with you to come to a peaceful resolution.
I want to ask you now about the management structure at Brookhouse in 2016, when you were first seconded to be Deputy Director. You say in your witness statement, paragraph 17, that between February and June, Steve Skitt was the Deputy Director who reported to you. Then Neil Davis, who's head of security, was head of security. Michelle Smith, head of care and regimes, and Jules Williams was residential manager, as well as Stacey Dean being head of Tinsley House, who reported directly to Steve Skitt. That changed then in 2017, 2018, where Sarah Newland reported to Skitt, and Sarah Edwards was appointed as safeguarding manager. Why was she appointed to safeguarding manager at that time?
Forgive me, I think you've missed a stage there. I think the stage you've missed is when in 2016, in March 2016, I introduced the head of safeguarding. Michelle Brown, as you said, was safety and regimes. That role was too expansive, so we introduced a head of support services and or a support services manager, which Dan Houghton stepped into. We then introduced Michelle Brown as the head of safeguarding, because I was cited on the works prior to my time as the Brookhouse interim director, works with the Stephen Shaw Adults at Risk policy, and I thought it was critical we introduce a head of safeguarding to take ownership of what was potentially coming down the line in terms of the recommendations from the Stephen Shaw report. So the head of safeguarding was introduced. I think by the time we'd recruited, etc., I'd made the recommendation. I think you've got the minutes of the meeting of when it was to introduced around May, June 2016, I think. In preparation for Ben to return to Brookhouse, we ensured there was a head of safeguarding in place to deal with what we knew was on the horizon, i.e. the Shaw recommendations.
Thank you. That was a topic I was going to come on to, so you've answered that question. I want to also ask you about what you've said in one of your Verita interviews. No need to bring it up. But you said that there was previously some difficult dynamics amongst the senior team, and that this then led to a management restructure. You also said there were some difficult relationships with Ben Saunders due to the number of grievances he had been subject to. What in particular are you referring to in relation to Ben Saunders?
If I can add context, it wasn't we didn't restructure as a consequence of that. When Kate interviewed me, it was more in relation to what had occurred previously at Brookhouse.
Just pause that. Kate Lampard,
Sorry,
who was one
Kate
of the
Lampard,
interviews
sorry,
for the report.
Forgive me. So when Kate Lampard interviewed me, it was on reflection of what had occurred at Brookhouse over the time. I think you'll see quite a bit of evidence where I'd been commissioned by Jerry Pedrick, our MD, to conduct a number of grievance investigations in relation to Ben and some of his senior management team over different periods of time. So I think so it wasn't aligned to a restructure. It was Kate Lampard's engagement with me to understand what the relationships were amongst the SMT.
But what you said to Kate Lampard in your Verita interview about difficult dynamics amongst the senior staff, that included Ben Saunders, I presume?
Yes, of course. So that adds the context to it. So you could see that over a number of years, he'd been subject to a number of grievances from a previous head of security, Wayne Debenham, a previous deputy director, Duncan Partridge, an issue arising with Stacey Dean and Michelle Smith. So there were a number of issues, and I think Ben even shares it within his own statement previously, that there were some difficult relationships with his team at that time.
And did you form a view about the leadership of Ben Saunders?
I think you see in my statement, Ben was very credible, cared for those in his care, he's seen the day-to-day delivery to be managed by Steve Skitt or his previous deputy, Duncan Partridge, and he would take more holistic overview of it being managed as from a business perspective, if I can say that. And I think Ben acknowledges that himself.
If we can put on the screen, please, one of your Verita interviews. I think it's the first one. It's VER 000266, page 15, please.
Thank you.
It's answer 198, so just scroll to the bottom, please. You'll see the question. Hang on, you have to go slow on all this because our heads are exploding. And you say, it's like Emmerdale. The reason I know this is because I end up coming down to do the grievance investigations. If we can then turn over the page, please. Sorry, the next page. Answer 238. The question is, it does sound as if Emmerdale's a good way of describing it. The sort of operational impact of this, from your perspective, just coming in and doing grievances, it can't be helpful. You say it's never helpful, is it, if the top team can't get their act together? I think as a consequence of that, the number of grievances that are on there at the moment are quite toxic. I've had to call people from external to Brookhouse to conduct grievances. That's why I'm saying it's not high churn, really, amongst the manager grades. But there have been quite a lot of grievances aimed at one another. What did you mean exactly by comparing it to Emmerdale? What was the problem, in your view?
I think the problem is evident, and I think I've already alluded to that problem. There were so many grievances amongst the senior management team. In terms of the Emmerdale, it was a loose statement because Kate Lampard, when I described, as I did with you a few moments ago, the number of grievances, Kate Lampard, it was hand to the head, and she said, it's spinning me and trying to understand where it was going. I said, yeah, there's a bit like Emmerdale here. And so it was a loose term, and forgive me on that loose term. But yes, there was obviously an element of chaoticness amongst that senior management team for the number of it's a very small team, and the number of grievances, being, and I think what I described then in terms of that culture was being observed by others within the centre, and what I inherited particularly in 2017 were a number of grievances aimed from peers to peers. Also, there didn't seem to be sufficient engagement to intervene at the right level. So there was a lot of, and when I tried engaging with the staff to understand why there were so many grievances, because I've worked in the custodial environment for 31 years, and I hadn't seen so many grievances from colleague to colleague and managers together. The engagement from staff was, the feedbacks tended to be, well, that's how we deal with issues, because that's what they were experiencing from those above them. Does that add context?
Yes. And why do you think there were so many grievances within the senior management team? You said that it came from above, that kind of attitude, but why was the problem within the senior management team?
Well, it was apparent there were some difficult relationships between the senior managers there at the time. When I attended there in 2017, one of the senior managers was on long-term absence. I met with her on the first time, 2016, I should say. So I met with her off-site to understand what the issues were and work to understand what the concerns were. And I think, as I shared with you earlier, there was a stretch of workload, and hence why I restructured in terms of dispersing some responsibilities, introducing other senior managers, so people felt confident that what they were expected to deliver, they had capacity to deliver.
The person you met off-site, was that Michelle Brown?
It was, yes.
Yeah. You mentioned there about staff saying that there were attitudes above them, the issues of grievances, the culture of grievances, which filtered down to the staff. The word toxic has been used a lot within this inquiry.
It was used by me on the first instance on this. I understand that in a different context. And if I add to that, if I can, there was the relationship that had broken down between Duncan Partridge and Ben Saunders. As I said, I was commissioned to investigate that because Duncan Partridge had raised a grievance against Ben. There was clearly, that message had been dispersed across the centre. People knew there were two camps on site, and that wasn't good role modelling from senior managers.
As you said about the toxic culture within the senior management team, I think that's fair to say that.
They were my words at the time, so yes.
Yes. And we've also talked about the toxicity possibly cascading down towards the more junior level staff.
In terms of how they dealt with issues with one another, yes. Not the wider culture in terms of how they treated those in their care.
So that's what.
But in terms of how they've dealt with when they had concerns with one another, and that we can discuss in a few moments in terms of my need to, in 2017, to introduce more frontline managers, really. So I had concerns about peers, managing peers, whereas we needed to introduce that management structure in place, because when individuals were clashing with one another, their first protocol was to submit a grievance of your behaviours.
I'll come on to that solution that you proposed in a moment, if I can. But in terms of that toxicity and the cascading down of the toxicity from senior management,
I don't think there's a correlation between the relationships between one another towards the relationships with detainees.
What about something that I don't know if you've been watching some of the witnesses give evidence? John Connolly, who gave evidence, he's agreed with Counsel to Inquiry Mr. Altman QC about the glorification of violence. He was talking about a specific incident where a detainee was on the netting and he was in the stairwell, and he accepted that it leads to a contagion of toxicity within the establishment, specifically talking about the glorification of violence. Do you agree with John Connolly that there was a glorification of violence which cascaded down to the way staff treated detainees?
No, that's why I said I don't think there's a correlation between people's relationship management and not dealing with issues through immediate intervention and supporting one another to the atrocious behaviours we've seen of people such as John Connolly in the stairwell. There's no correlation between people having personal relationships and their method of addressing that was through grievance, because they thought that was the route to address that, to the abhorrent behaviours that we'd seen in the stairwell. So I do not see a direct correlation between the two relationships.
What about the macho culture within Brookhouse amongst the staff? Did you observe that at any point?
No, I didn't. When I was there in 2016, what I observed was a very professional staff group, and I think post Panorama, if I can reflect on this, post Panorama, of course you look yourself in the mirror and say, I've spent some time in there. I spent 5 months in there last year. Why didn't I witness that? I've been sort of in this industry for 31 years in the custodial sector, and over the years I've observed some inappropriate behaviours, and we've made sure that we've either engaged with the police to challenge such behaviours, and we've dismissed people for such behaviours, whether it was in the public sector or the private sector. So what we observed there was, as I said, was abhorrent behaviours. What I observed when I was there in 2016, and what I was then pleased when I looked at the Hmip report, which was published in January 17, that confirmed my views as well. The staff were doing an excellent job in very difficult circumstances at Brookhouse. We understand there are a very small minority who've engaged in the way they have, and as you know, myself, we engage with the police as well to ensure that they were prosecuted for their behaviours, not just missed from employment. But the behaviours that I've seen generally and the relationships I've seen with between staff and detainees was excellent at Brookhouse.
Aside from what we saw from
Aside
Panorama?
from, as I've just said, aside from what we've seen there, absolutely.
Is it possible to put that to one side, given that there was such a long period of filming of different staff attitudes
and as I said,
behaviours?
Retrospectively, I would never put that aside, and this has to be some significant learning for all. And as I said, I looked myself in the mirror when I observed Panorama in September 17, because I'd been there sort of 18 months prior to that. So no, you wouldn't put that aside. But I too relate what I said to you a few moments ago. The behaviours you've seen for the majority of the staff, their relationships with detainees, were excellent.
I want to ask you about something we just mentioned earlier about your solution to the issue about there being lots of different grievances within the senior management team and how dysfunctional it was. You also describe in your Verita interview about there being a management by matrix. Could you explain what you meant by that, and also what the proposed solution was?
Yeah, of course, yeah. So I think, as I shared with you earlier, there was, my personal view, insufficient senior managers. The seed was initially planted by Michelle Brown when I met her off-site, really, prior to look at how we could support Michelle to come back to work. When I realised the broad range of activities that Michelle was trying to manage at that point, that gave me the opportunity to review and reflect on the current senior management team. When we introduced the head of sport services, the head of safeguarding in preparation for the Stephen Shaw recommendations in relation to adult risk. And that seemed to be, during 2016, that seemed to be, put everything back in its place where we had some structure amongst the senior management team. At that point in time, there were no real issues amongst the DCMs, because we hadn't experienced what we all know through a retrospective lens. We all seen what happened in 2017, particularly with, and if I can align it to what was happening in the wider custodial estate late 2016, had a major influence on what occurred within the immigration estate in 2017. We'd seen a number of major prison disturbances as a consequence of spice. We'd seen that at Bedford, we'd seen it at Birmingham, we'd seen it at Swaleside. And aligned to that, there were the closures of within the IRC estate, Dover, Hasler, etc. So a lot of the population that was coming into the IRC estate were coming from the prisons, and I think we'll discuss it at some point later. Time served foreign national offenders in the custodial estate in the IRC in 2013, as per the Hmip report, were at 5%. In 2017, they were between 50 and 55%. So the whole population mix had changed. And as a consequence of that, you could see that DCMs, you all see the spice endemic, and you could see that DCMs were responding to incidents and had insufficient time to actually manage the resource that they would normally do. So when I discussed matrix management in the content, forgive me for adding so much context to it, was that when we were trying to manage functions, the member staff on the front line didn't have a direct line manager to engage with for their own personal development and for advice and guidance. And where the matrix management occurred was that they were looking up, but managers were just filling in. Hence why we then increased the number of DCMs to ensure that, because when we engage with staff to understand what they wanted from managers, it wasn't seeing the centre director walking around every day, which would only spend 15, 20 minutes on a unit if you could get onto there at different points of the time. They wanted their direct frontline supervisor to give them that support. So that frontline supervisor is there to give them that support throughout the day. So that moved us away from matrix management, both back to a more traditional hierarchy where the staff, because we had very much high level of inexperienced staff there, they could have and seek that immediate support from their supervisors.
You mentioned there about the director coming around and being on the wing for 15 or 20 minutes a day. You also say in your statement that managers need to be more visible and show support to staff. That was from an SMT meeting that you were commenting about from April 2016.
16, that was, yeah.
Yeah. There was also, that was a comment, by Steve Skitt, and that was a comment that you supported, and that you said that it was important to check in on areas they didn't manage, talking about managers, in order to raise and maintain challenge.
Absolutely.
What caused you to say this, to raise that?
What I think Steve raised it.
Steve raised it,
yes,
sorry.
Yeah,
what caused you to say about the issues about different managers going to different wings, I assume, in order to challenge what was going on in each wing?
Absolutely. If you walk the same plot every day, you'll become quite sort of blinded to what's happening wider. Whereas if we can encourage managers to walk into different departments, you're looking at it through a different lens. And by looking through a different lens, you can provide better ideas and give some feedback, really. So it was ensuring that people didn't just focus on their own area. It's walk on the areas of others, not just on the residential units, all areas, to improve the standards within the facility. And be quite candid with one another, ensure that you are giving constructive feedback to ensure that standards were raised.
We've heard from many witnesses to the inquiry that senior managers were not visible on the wings in 2017. You made these comments in April 2016. Had this improved by the time you'd returned to Brookhouse in September 2017?
What I would suggest by September 2017, they were still stretched there. You'll see that we then introduced another senior manager, forgive me, where the engagement we were having with staff was that they wanted, as I alluded to a few moments ago, they wanted access to their supervisors. Yes, we encourage the senior management team to walk about, to be visible, to understand what was occurring, because you'll never know, unless you do a bit of managed by walkabouts, you'll never know what's happening on that front line. So, there was a need for managers to be present on the unit, but I think, as all managers will say, all staff will say, what they wanted was the direct supervision, as I described earlier.
I want to ask you now about detained persons' welfare and the engagement with detained persons. In a senior management meeting on the 30th of March 2016, you said that the improvements to welfare led to it being a victim of its own success, as it's being signposted to deal with everything. And by that, I assume you mean the welfare department, the welfare team. Why did you say that, given that there's a dedicated team there? Why was it a victim of its own success?
In fact, that was praise, victim of its own success, because they were an excellent team. I think if you interviewed one of the welfare officers, Owen Sirott, his work with detainees was phenomenal. He really cared. He would go that extra mile for the individuals. The welfare office was in the main thoroughfare of the facility, and a lot of the detainees' frustrations was aimed at everyone had hope. They all hoped they could remain in the UK. Of course they could, and they would reach out and try and engage with the Home Office to have an update on their case, because indefinite detention was very frustrating for them, and Owen and the team would work with them very closely to understand, and a lot of the time was signposting because they couldn't do much else than that. But the welfare team was an innovation. Again, I think Michelle Brown was a driver behind the support in the welfare team. Why he became a victim of his own success, being in that main thoroughfare, which is a busy part of the centre, it was in some respects the strongest survived. Some detainees were pushing themselves and pushing their way in or barging into the office to have access to the welfare team because they were in demand. We did then, and as a consequence of, I think the term is victim of own success was a celebration of how well they were doing. We then increased the size of the team, introduced a booking system, etc. But still that was subject to some form of conflict in the areas because everyone wanted to see that welfare officer. And so we invested in increasing the team. We then put it into the off the main thoroughfare corridor into the legal visit area, so people would need to book to access the visit. I understand that that's been reversed and is now back in the thoroughfare, but there seems to be a better system in place.
And I want to ask you about detainee consultative meetings. During a meeting that you chaired, the one we've just been talking about, in fact, no, a few weeks earlier, sorry, the 3rd of March 2016, you said you wanted more structure to detainee consultative forums. There is a need to decide which managers should or should not attend. Who would normally have attended those detainee consultative meetings?
Generally, I think it would have been Steve as the deputy, Steve Skitt as the deputy. A member of the Home Office staff at the time, I think it was Simon Levitt. The members of the IMB would be invited and the representatives from each of the units. I attended a number myself. The reason I think I was asking for more structure at the time, I think that was 1 month into my training there, so I stepped in to get to know the detainees initially. And what their frustrations was that when they raised an issue, they were recalling that they raised it with another manager last month. And as in any structured agendaed meeting, we'd want the regular attendees. So it was to improve, I think the process was very good. It was to improve the process to ensure there was continuity in the relationship between those present.
So before you arrived, there wasn't an agenda for the meeting?
No, there was an agenda, but it was potentially chaired by different people.
I see. So it should be the same manager that chaired the meeting?
Ideally, I wanted continuity so that at least the detainees were having direct feedback from those who were taking the actions.
And I want to move to a short, quick other topic about no-notice charters. You raised concerns in IMB meetings in November and December 2017 about no-notice charters. They are charter flights that take place within a 3-month window and are not told to detainees when they will be going on them. What concerns did you have about these and why?
The concerns I have is, if I can, I don't think this can be quick because this was so detrimental to the relationships within the centre. No notice charters, you'll see from the evidence within the IMB. I shared it with senior civil servants who attended, senior Home Office officials, the MP would attend. I raised my concerns about no notice charters. They were having a detrimental effect and impact on relationships within the centre. Our fundamental role is to care for people. A lot of these people have been residing in this country for the vast majority of their lives. Time served foreign national offenders, they'd come into detention and be subject to a charter flight. They were given a 3-month window, but we'd be knocking on their door to advise them they go in this evening. They'd had no opportunity to engage with families, friends, loved ones, etc. And when that started happening, I raised my concerns. It continued. And as part of the Panorama Action Plan, I engaged with detainees to understand what was frustrating them. And they were saying that the relationships within the centre, same as any relationship in life, is based on trust. And when a member of staff has been asked, detainees could see the demographics in the centre changing considerably, because you'll see the number of charters we were trying to manage on a weekly basis. And so the demographics of the centre were changing significantly. Detainees were aware of that, so then they'd see many people of their own nationality arriving into the centre in that particular time leading up to the charter, and they'd engage with staff to understand, is there a charter going to my country? Staff were encouraged to be disingenuous and be sort of not aware of what the charters were, because staff weren't aware of what charters were occurring. As a consequence of that, removals, when the removals occurred, they occurred. But very often, a JR would occur, and some detainees obviously would return back to the centre. And you can imagine that relationship back to, from the detainee's perspective, when you're then back engaging with that member of staff, who you, from your perception, they've blatantly lied to you, there was a charter going this evening.
Yep,
But that was quite damaging in terms of relationships between the staff and the detainees. And as a forgive me if I can, the consequence of the notice charters is that very often people with such short notice to leave the country, take the 3-month window away, because people are living day by day, hoping that tomorrow's going to be better than today. When that opportunity is taken away from them, and they're then told they're being removed without that wider engagement, we surprise ourselves how use of force increased. I'm not surprised by that, because it was a significant contributing factor to the number of use of force that we've observed. So that's why I raised it in that meeting, and forgive the adding too much context.
You said that that staff were encouraged to be disingenuous about when they
No, I didn't say. I didn't.
Was.
I said staff were perceived to be disingenuous. The direction was the staff weren't informed. Only a very small group of staff were advised on the charters, because ultimately most of the staff there, as I've said to you earlier, care for those in their care. So they would have shared that information. But directions to us was to ensure that it was, it wasn't, the message wasn't cascaded out to many.
So the message to us, who from?
From the Home Office.
And why was that message, do you think?
Because they didn't nobody wanted the charter disrupted.
Did the Home Office take on board these concerns that you raised?
No notice charters still alive today. I don't know, I don't work in the IRC estate, but I should imagine somebody can answer that.
But did you follow it up with any of the Home Office? Paul Gaston was present at that meeting.
I think it's very clear it wasn't only that meeting that I raised it. I raised it in all engagement, and I've said that in my own statement.
You said in your Verita interview that the Home Office was critical of G4S staff for showing, I quote, showing too much empathy, supporting detainees in their appeals and the likes. What's the basis for that comment?
That comment was it's anecdotal, based on an engagement I had with Ben following a Home Office visit that he'd had. There was a point in time, I think it would be about 2014, around that period of time, where there was a view from government in relation to removal centres are removal centres. So all engagement should be about removal. And we understand what the removal centre's for, but our role on site isn't about removal. Our role on site is to care for individuals, and as I said, give hope to individuals for tomorrow, to ensure tomorrow is a better day than today. And as long as there was hope there for that individual's cause, people would engage with them and support them and signpost them to either some legal guidance, advice. We created the welfare office, etc. So but the rhetoric from government at the time, I think we've all seen it around 2014 time. It was all quite the rhetoric was, generally all about removals.
And was that that was your impression as well? That wasn't just what Ben Saunders had discerned from the Home Office. Your impression was also that that the Home Office thought G4S were too supportive of detainees.
I wasn't there at the time, but what I will say is that when I did arrive there in 2016, and what I experienced was staff engaging and caring and giving and supporting that hope, not leading on to a false hope, but supporting that.
I'm not asking whether G4S
No,
staff were in fact
sorry.
support. I'm asking you, was it your impression that the Home Office thought G4S were too supportive of detainees?
I didn't have that. It was a bit anecdotal at the time, and I wasn't working there at the time. I'm just relaying what was fed back to me.
When you were working there in 2016, before the relevant period, was that your impression?
I think my comment in relation to the no-notice charters answers that, because the focus was on removal, whereas my focus and the majority of the staff focus was in terms of building relationship to have that rapport with individuals.
So is the answer yes?
I can't answer that on behalf of the Home Office. I can only answer on personal experiences, which I think I've shared.
The question was about your impression of what the Home Office thought about G4S.
Based on what was fed back to me and what I've shared, then it's apparent that the wider Home Office, not individuals, because a lot of individuals, majority of individuals in the Home Office on site had the same caring approach that what we experienced.
You say the emphasis from the Home Office was on removals. Was there also an emphasis on security? Because we see from Professor Bosworth's report, Professor Bosworth is an expert that's been commissioned by this inquiry to look into the culture at Brookhouse. She says that there's a recent study of prison officers, study of prisoners officers point out, staff treatment of vulnerable people hinges on their view of the purpose of their job. Officers' attitudes seem to vary dependent on how important they view care as an aspect of their job, with officers demonstrating more favourable attitudes towards offenders and suicide-related behaviour when they see care as their primary role. She also talks about there being an emphasis on security at Brookhouse rather than care. Do you accept that emphasis on security over care?
No, day to day, okay. The centre was a secure centre, and when you walk into Brookhouse, I think you heard to say it was designed to CAPI standards, so it had a secure perimeter, very similar to what you'd experience within a prison environment. There was a focus from parts of the Home Office in relation to security. We'd experienced within the IRC estate over a period of time in 2015-16 escapes from what were supposed to be the two most secure sites, Colnbrook in Heathrow and Brookhouse. Unfortunately, under my watch in March 16, we had an escape from there. So there was a lot of focus from the Home Office to ensure that we maintained security and we ensured that it was secure not to have another escape. But generally, so that was the infrastructure of the building, and there was obviously a security department to ensure that, because we know how the escapes occurred, that daily fabric checks took place, etc., to ensure that there were no aids to escape. So that's looking at from security from an escape perspective. Through another lens, you can look at security in terms of relationships, behaviours, bullying, etc. There was a focus around security information reports in terms of relationships with people. So there's that monitoring, but again within the security department and how we'd relay that information. But in terms of your frontline staff who engaged every day, when you had 2 to 3 people looking after 100, 120 men, their relationship wasn't about security. Their relationship was about building a rapport with those in their care and maintaining a very good relationship. Because in the absence of a good relationship and building that rapport, there would be chaos within the centre. And I know you'll say chaos in the centre, what we've observed, but generally within the centre, it was well ordered. People did adhere to the structured regime that are in place. But that structured regime in such an environment will only ever work when there's a good relationship between those being detained and those caring for those being detained.
I want to ask you now about the physical environment. You just mentioned that of Brookhouse. And firstly, about the extra beds programme. This is a programme that was introduced following a request from the Home Office in 2014 to increase the population of Brookhouse, which meant putting in an extra 60 beds and converting some of the rooms to 3-man rooms. You say in your Verita interview that you got myself involved through the process. What was the nature and extent of your involvement in that process?
Okay. As you just discussed, the Home Office engaged with Ben and Kalpesh, who was the commercial finance manager at the time, to look at increasing the bed spaces at Brookhouse. Brookhouse being a modern facility, and if I can just add, it wasn't just Brookhouse, it was Tinsley House also, because we increased the number of bed spaces at Tinsley at the same time. That went through a refurbishment. So there was a real focus that the Home Office needed to extend their own population. They've been quite dependent upon the prison service for bed spaces for many years. Post-austerity, etc., prisons were closing. So the bed spaces within the prison environment, which the Home Office could make use of, were reducing significantly. At the same time, the Home Office were also closing Dover, because ex-prison, and they'd approached Ben to look at putting a third bed. The initial request was for put a third bed in all rooms. So that would not increase by 60, that would have been by 180 at the time.
And why didn't that happen?
Because as an organisation, there wasn't the centre. Even with the knowledge we had at that time, we all knew the centre wouldn't have coped with it at that point. So the appropriate risk assessments were done, site reviews, etc., and all parties at the time in 2014, 2015, all believed that the centre could cope with the additional 60 detainees.
And what was your specific
if I can, I'll answer that if I can, sorry. At the time, as I said, in 2013-14, there were 5% time served foreign national offenders. So therefore, a lot of people were coming into the centre on short-term detention. The average stay was 28 days, but generally there were 1, 2, 3, 4 days. There were a couple of long stays, but generally the average population was 28 days. And with the activity spaces for short-term holding, there seemed to be sufficient space there, and everyone seemed to be comfortable with the increased bed spaces, including myself. Then negotiations went on for quite a considerable period of time with the Home Office about the bed spaces.
Can I just pause there? About the number of bed spaces, not the fact that bed spaces would have to be made. Additional
No, okay, sorry. Even though they'd asked for 3 beds in all rooms initially, our response was 3 beds on the lower ground floor on 3 of the units to put an additional bed into 20 of the rooms on each of the units to increase from 408 to 508 across the whole centre. So the negotiations took quite a while, because at the same time we were also submitting our proposal for the increased bed spaces at Tinsley House. Tinsley House is more dormitory type effect, and some of the rooms there were holding, I think, 5, some up to 6 people in an individual room. On reflection, we can all look back, the benefit of it, it's good to look through the lens, and retrospectively we can see there was I'll describe it a bit as a bit of a Venn diagram in some respects, where as we were increasing the population, at the same time the spice issues were occurring. At the same time, the prison population in the establishments, because prisons had themselves been subject to a number of disturbances, bed spaces were becoming quite tight within the prison environment, and a lot of guys who previously may have been held in the prison environment under IS 91 and would have stayed within the prison environment until much closer to their release date were now finding their way into the IRC estate. As a consequence of that, we were now looking after some guys with some long periods of time, quite a number of them, over 2 years, quite a number over 18 months, and quite a few over 12 months. And as I said to Kate and Ed in my Verita interview, the the regime opportunities for people in long-term detention isn't what an IRC, an immigration centre, was designed for.
So there were lots of consequences to through the new regime of the three beds in a cell. You've mentioned there the pressure on
Not just the 3
activities.
beds in the cells, the length of detention, even when you take away the 3rd bed, and now with hindsight, you can look at it, the length of detention, there was quite a restricted regime compared to a prison regime. So even though we are giving prisoners a lot more freedom, detainees compared to prisoners, a lot more freedom within the environment, and they've come, as I said, 55% have come from a prison environment. They've got the freedom of movement within the centre, which they may not have within a prison environment, albeit they didn't have sufficient activity which a prison environment can provide them. Because our gym facility, for example, was a hotel type gym. There was no sports hall. Yes, there were courtyards to have a game of 3, 4, 5-a-side football, but it wasn't the structure and regime that is offered within a prison environment. Does that make sense?
Yes. So the activities were insufficient for the number of people that you had.
The activities were insufficient for the duration of stay. I don't think the activities were insufficient for the numbers, because if the numbers had been short-term, it would have been enough to keep you interested and occupied. But for the length of stay is where the real rub came.
But presumably that was there was more pressure on those activities with the increase of 60 beds in 2016. There's more pressure on the activities with more people, surely.
There's more pressure on activities, but there was sufficient activities. There was sufficient activity space. It was just the variety activity was limited.
You said in your Verita interview, your second Verita interview, that there was not sufficient activity space in Brookhouse for 448 detained persons, let alone 508.
Because we couldn't, we didn't have, and that isn't space as in, forgive my term, bums on seats. That was space in looking at alternative activities to keep the men interested in.
So you weren't talking there about physical space, you were talking about...
Yes, physical space in terms of us being able to offer something else, something beyond just the cultural kitchen or just the classroom or just something within a prison environment. We talk about different workshops, different activities, etc. So if I give an example, there was no sport. I think I've already shared this example. There was no sports hall there. The religious services area, whereas we often make use of that within a prison environment beyond just worship, it was a very small area. So it was the capacity to offer more, I think, was what was causing me concern.
So when did you voice those concerns?
When I experienced it in 2017.
You didn't think that before that might have been an issue?
No, I didn't. And but I said when I first engaged, it was through the initial analysis of it was sufficient. There was sufficient churn to enable the regime to provide a decent service.
And you don't think those problems with activities, other pressures on healthcare and so on would have been foreseeable?
I think if you continue with short-term detention, it would still cope. It was the length of stay and the general frustration that caused the concern. And when we look at where healthcare got stretched, there was sufficient resource in healthcare to deal with the, because there was sufficient detailed risk assessments between us, the Home Office and the Ministry of Justice Estates Department, because that's who were the advisors to the Home Office at the time. We'd engaged at all levels. So this wasn't a G4S in isolation decision, it wasn't a Home Office in isolation, and it wasn't MOJ Estates directed. There was a tripartite engagement to understand could the centre cope with, but we were basing it on, unfortunately, data that preceded what actually occurred, and that data would have meant the short-term detention would have been served sufficiently, I think, even at 508. But as soon as we've seen people staying there for extended periods of time, it became an issue. And where I was going with the, in relation to the healthcare being stretched around the same period of time, as I alluded to earlier, there was a considerable, we all know it, the spice endemic and the increased time served foreign national offenders coming into the centre and bringing prison learned behaviours, and unfortunately the what had occurred around the spice and the NPS as it was known at the time, that was finding its way into the IRC estate, and in particularly into Brookhouse. As a consequence of that, then healthcare were responding to these emergency calls, of course, because men were in a very poor state as a consequence of taking this. So that at the same time, go back to my bit of a Venn diagram with a bit of a red dot in the middle, all these issues are happening at the same time, and the hotspot at that particular time, we've all had sight of it.
But the additional beds weren't just an issue, surely, because of the length of stay or the spice epidemic. If there are more people within a short-term holding facility than there were before, a significant increase, that's likely to have had an effect on detainees' welfare, isn't it? The fact that they would be in the same 3 people in a cell, there'd be less privacy, smells, noise, all of those issues are likely to become a problem, aren't they?
Well, it's apparent they have become, but when the initial risk assessments were done and the analysis was, the cells were much bigger than other custodial, the rooms were much bigger than other custodial cells, and the guidance given to us as operators there was sufficient space, because when they compared that to other custodial facilities where they had put a third person in, these rooms were even larger than that. But I think we'll all take on board from, we know that Stephen Shaw made his recommendation, and Ian Castle, who I think he was sat here this morning, he then advised me that the third bed was no longer to be used. And I think with the benefit of hindsight, I think we understand why that decision was made.
But it didn't need hindsight, did it? Because the Hmip, in their inspection report, known as bring up on screen VER 00117, page 4, said that the use of extra beds would lead to a decline in living standards.
Peter Clark did say that in his executive summary. He didn't take to putting that into a recommendation. But ultimately, even though I've lived through the experience of it, all I can suggest is it was a decision. This isn't saying this was a decision by the Home Office, because as I said, we were all party to the decision. It was from a Chief West perspective, we responded to the request from the Home Office. We provided the solution. We engaged with, as I said, within the necessary agencies. I understand, as I said, from the MOJ Estates Department, where sufficient risk assessments were conducted in terms of ventilation, etc. And the third bed was brought in. So I can advise you on what the journey is. I think we've all accepted on what the review is, on what is conducted, and what Stephen Shaw's recommendation was, and advise you that at the moment, as I'm aware, the third bed has now been removed and no longer in use.
You said in your witness statement that there was no resistance to the programme, the third room programme, from a G4S perspective, and that was because it was a commercial opportunity for G4S.
And that commercial opportunity isn't, don't make the assumption that's a financial opportunity. Commercial opportunity is the Home Office are our customer, and we are here to serve our customer. The landlord of the facility was the Home Office. They wanted to increase the bed spaces. They needed to increase the bed spaces across the wider IRC estate. We engaged with Tinsley. I know we're not having the engagement about Tinsley, but we put 5 people in a room at Tinsley. I think that one might even be 6. But the Home Office needed to increase the bed space, and they came to us as one of their suppliers to engage if we would extend the opportunity for them at Brookhouse.
And I assume with an increase in opportunity, there was an increase in profits to be made.
So I'll answer that in a slightly different way. There was a reduction in cost to the Home Office because there was a blended rate. So the cost per detainee placed per day actually is the full blended rate reduced. So as a taxpayer, we've seen the benefits of that in terms of a reduced rate.
But in terms of G4S, that meant you had.
Of course, if you increase revenue, of course you'd increase profit. That's a commercial world.
I want to ask you now a bit about the bid process. At paragraph 2 of your witness statement, and this is something that we've been through before, that you were the business development a mobilisation transformation director between 2011 and 2014, and that involved operational contracts following successful bids. And then 2014-2016, you're development director. Were you involved in the bidding process in June 2014?
Yeah, I would have been. I'm trying to recall. So my involvement in all bids for custodial facilities was as the operational lead.
And you'll be aware then that at the time the bid process at that time in 2014, that Brookhouse was designed to be a 72-hour centre, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, but but that was 2008 was when the Brookhouse main bid was for it to be a 72-hour centre. By the time we get 2014, I'm trying to, why I'm looking a bit glazed there, is the bid process in 2014 you're alluding to?
If we can perhaps go to the bid process in 2007, because, or rather, sorry, the commercial evaluation in 2007. If we can please bring up DL 00000140. And page 40, please. You'll see there, we can turn our heads. This is a Home Office slide from Brookhouse Operating Contract Commercial Evaluation from the 7th of December 2007. If we can go to page 7, please. 47, rather. See at the top of the slide there about pricing. Brookhouse tenders delivered significant 35% cost savings compared to the original budget and is below the current average cost per bed when compared to the like of 2009 projections. So were you bid manager at G4S at the time?
I was for G4S, and I remember this coming out because unfortunately we as G4S didn't win the bid. So I remember it was GSL who won the bid, but at the time I was representing G4S, so one of our competitors at the time was successful in this bid.
I see. I want to move now to use of force, and in particular MMPR. You've stated in your witness statement, paragraph 108, that MMPR was not related to Brookhouse as it was a restraint method for minors. We've heard from John Connolly, who was a CNR instructor, that at the time MMPR was the main restraint model, which officers used and were trained in 2017. This contrasts to a lot of other evidence which says that it was not. Are you able to provide an explanation for that?
I can't explain what John Connolly said, but what I do know, what John Connolly said is wrong. MMPR is for to be used on under 18s.
And was it used at Brookhouse?
Not used at Brookhouse.
Thank you.
It was used at Tinsley House, because at Tinsley House we had a pre-departure accommodation looking after minors.
Thank you. I want to now ask you about another meeting that you had on the 3rd of March 2006, 30th of March 2016, one we've already alluded to. You said governance needs to be tightened in relation to use of force meetings. And you say that there needed to be a consistent approach to use of force meetings with regular times, consistent agendas to ensure the functional head and structures were available. Who had attended these meetings in 2006 before any changes were made? Again,
when I went there in February 16, I'd sort of met with Michelle and others to understand the structure. Part of mine is to understand how critical areas such as use of force, etc., were being managed. There seemed to, so I looked at previous meeting notes, etc. There seemed to be inconsistency, again, in relation to what I did with the detainee meetings. Inconsistent attendees, and we'll never get real learning when you don't have that continuity. So, and I knew I'd already thought of introducing the head of safeguarding, but I wanted the continuity. I think at the time it was Neil Davis to chair the use of force meetings, But senior managers aren't the subject matter experts in some areas, and particularly they need to make use of the use of force coordinators. So what I was engaging at that point was to ensure that the meeting will take place on a regular occurrence with the continuity of the correct people being present, so we could then share the lessons learned from the reviews to pass on to the trainers through the use of force coordinator to develop the staff conducting the
And did
reviews.
that in fact happen on your watch after 2016?
It improved, and I think you'll see that Hmip in their 2016 report published in January 17, they said use of force governance was good.
You've said in paragraph 105 of your witness statement that there were improvements were made, albeit it was apparent that this was not sustained. That suggests that
That suggested what I've just described, where the Hmip accepted as being good governance in place, that when I returned there in 17, and I'm not offering any mitigation, I can understand how it did fall away, because the use of force coordinator who was driving a lot of that had left the business. Steve Skitt, to his credit, had introduced scrutiny meetings, but they weren't to the level, and this isn't being critical of those who attended the scrutiny meetings, but we did need a use of force coordinator. By the time I arrived there in September 17, the use of force coordinators that had been in place, not only had the one prior had sort of resigned and left, we then dismissed some during the post-panorama.
So that was John Connolly. He was the use of force coordinator. Who replaced him then after that?
I had to get, I think you'll lead on to this in a few moments, I had to reach out to other parts of our custodial business, and I had support from a team from Park Prison.
We heard from Dave Webb during this inquiry that the meetings, and I say meetings in inverted commas, that took place of use of force review meetings were simply him looking through the footage and doing what he described, and that was obvious, a tick box exercise, looking at the videos and seeing if there were any lessons learned. Are you talking about an extra layer of scrutiny above this, or are you talking about those?
No,
use of
we
force review
introduced 3 layers of scrutiny. And I understand I had similar concerns with Dave as well, because he was inexperienced in that role, because we'd lost the...
Just pause there. It's not a criticism of necessarily of him being.
No,
in the
it
role.
isn't. It's the process.
The
I
meeting
understand.
itself.
It's the
yes.
process. I understand that. So, post-panorama, when I arrived there, even though we'd introduced body-worn cameras in 2016-ish, that was generally for managers, etc. A critical priority for me was to introduce body-worn cameras across the centre. So by December 17, we'd introduced the body-worn cameras for all staff. And what the reassurance I wanted from the duty directors on site was that when a use of force occurred, because we know that we didn't have the skill set in relation to the use of force coordinator at this point, when a use of force occurred, it was for the duty director to review all use of force, to review the body-worn camera, to ensure that the initial engagement on a spontaneous incident, for example, had been to de-escalate, to engage, etc., and it had to be justified. So that's what I was going to go with the first element of it. So the 3 layers was the Oscar one on site would respond, would ensure that all information was collated, all use of force reports completed. The second line of defence was obviously the duty director doing the review to ensure that there was justified use of force. And the third layer of defence, even though they used Dave Webb because the duty director wasn't a subject matter expert, but they'd understand if it had been de-escalated. Dave's role was introduced not as use of force coordinator to ensure that he could look through to his lens. So I can understand why it's called the tick box from his perspective, was to ensure that the correct techniques and the like from his perspective were done. And then we introduced, so that was the 3 lines of defence in some respects, and then the scrutiny meeting would review it in terms of getting the wider lessons learned.
And those 3 layers, those were in place at Brookhouse at the time in the relevant period, 2017?
No, I can't talk of the relevant period, but what I'm
You
what I
were
just
there
what I
in
just
September 2017. Were they there then?
well, what wasn't there in time because the body-worn camera coverage by the duty director. I introduced the duty director checks post panorama. The governance in my time in 2016, as you will see from the Hmip report in from October November 2016, cites that the use of force governance was good.
Right, but the three layers of protection of, or scrutiny rather, in September 2017 when you were there, the only layer of scrutiny in fact was the Dave Webb's tick box
No, I
reviews.
don't know what occurred at that time because I should imagine during the relevant period, that was prior to the dismissals of your John Connolly's, etc., etc. So I'm assuming the use of force committee was taking place, but I understand that Steve had introduced the scrutiny meeting at that point because I think there was some inconsistent attendees. We'd lost Dave Eldridge, who had been the use of force coordinator.
And the scrutiny meeting, that was above that, so that was a fourth.
No, I introduced that later as the fourth, but Steve had put that in initially as the use of force meeting. Steve responded following the departure of Dave Eldridge.
I want to ask you now about the reaction to Panorama. Did you watch it live?
I did.
And how do you explain what you saw there?
I can't. As well, I haven't got words for it. It was shocking. I think I shared with you earlier. I had to reflect on that immediately afterwards. You'll always look yourself in the mirror to understand these were people, I didn't know many of them, who actually we'd seen on the observations, but it was a completely different centre to what I'd experienced when I was there in 2016. So your first protocol is always to look at yourself.
And did you said you looked at yourself, there's some introspection. Was there some...
To understand what I'd missed, had I missed anything? And I did take some solace in the fact of, when you do look, were these behaviours happening on my watch? Of course you're going to check yourself on that, because ultimately, I know why I joined this sector many years ago. It's to care for people. That wasn't caring for people.
And did you have a view of how it could have happened?
No, but I've got a retrospective review on it as we speak. But I was disappointed, and you'll see this in my statement, forgive me. We are employed by a private company, but we're public servants. And when we train our staff to be custodial officers, whether that's from my prison perspective, prison custodial officers, or in the detained state as detained custodial officers, they all have a responsibility to us as members of the state, and that is they're trained to report on any wrongdoing. And watching that, and I'm not going to call it, I can't call it the use of force, watching that assault in the cell, I think you can sense now, my stomach is still dropped here. It was horrendous. And not one of them had the even own personal responsibility to submit that report. And I really, I've got no answers for it, other than to say we know what the staff are trained in, we know what they know what their responsibilities are, but it wasn't reported.
There was some serious thinking after Panorama, obviously.
Absolutely.
Which included working with UCL and the Jill Dando Institute for Security with Nick Ross and Professor Richard Wortley. So there were some answers that were offered there, and it was in particular about culture. I won't bring some on screen because we don't have time. But you spoke about in your Verita interview, in your first Verita interview, VER 000266, page 20, A266. You're talking about the period of November 2017, and you were talking about the context of why people didn't call out behaviour, and you're referring particularly to the John Connolly incident. that it's just something that I was discussing with Jill Dando Institute last week about general behaviours. We were looking at the Milgram experiment and the likes, and how people can be pushed into the direction of behaviours. There's also a G4S action plan, CGS 0073911, page 10, where there's also a reference to Milgram. And for everyone that doesn't know, the 1960s experiment in the social psychology field, which was about people being led to abuse by those who instruct them. And there were people who were administering potentially fatal shocks to people in their care, and those people were called learners. The G4S action plan specifically mentions the Milgram experiments. That is, and you've also mentioned in your Verita interview about this a well-known Stanford prison experiment, which had similar effects. You also mention Abu Ghraib as well, not by name, but you say that you talk about what come out of Iraq and the abuse of servicemen in Iraq there. It was obviously it obviously was being taken very seriously, as that, to mention those two experiments. And it appears to have been accepted by you that it was a cultural problem. Is that right?
What was taken by me, and the three examples we give, Stanford, Milgram, and Abu Ghraib, is the issues that I raised, and I've used all three of them in presentations to numerous stakeholders, because I had to question myself, was it cultural? Was it widespread within the centre? Because having observed it, you need to test how wide that is. Hence us engaging with UCL, Jill Dando Institute, and Nick Ross and Professor Richard Boatley, is to try and get some learning. On that journey, I raised them as based on my own awareness and experiences, etc., to understand how were people behaving in that way in an environment that when you walk around, you didn't observe it. And I think what I was pleased about, and then I had to test, was I being naive when I was walking around, hence why I invited Nick Ross and Professor Richard Boatley on site, and many other stakeholders. We engaged with the Immigration Minister at the time, Caroline Noakes, Andrew Mitchell, the MP, wanted to have a walk around. And I had a complete open door policy. I wanted people to look at it through a different lens. Was I being naive? Because I was most certainly judging myself when I observed panorama. And what became apparent was that the behaviours were most certainly conducted by a minority of people, that the staff on site were as embarrassed and as angry as I was, which actually I was pleased about. And we did take that learning. I did share that each of the experiments that we just discussed, and my consideration initially was to put them onto the initial training course and put all staff through a refresher course on that. But we did have some wider considerations of, is that really undermining the staff and the majority who actually do go to work every day to ensure that tomorrow's better than today for others. So it gave us an opportunity to reflect as an organisation where we were going with it, and I think you'll have had sight of Professor Shibertley and Nick Ross's visit, based on we were going in the right direction.
So that's right. We've got the notes of the meetings, the emails. Again, I won't bring them up because of time purposes, but CGS 0073865, pages 1 to 4. Nick Ross wrote to you summarising what he thought of that were the cultural and problematic issues at Brookhouse. And he said, you are charged with detaining people in high security conditions, and you have the overriding need to acknowledge that some of those detained may prove the right to remain in the UK like any other citizen. He says it is heightened by the fact that some detainees face frightening, disheartening, life-changing deportation, which can lead to depression, self-harm, risk of suicide, and so on. There is a need for considerable sensitivity. He then suggested relatively minor changes. So about recruitment being campaigns being crystal clear as to what candidates will face if appointed, because there was a mismatch between the expectation and what in fact was the reality. Sanctions for
The mismatch between what you were saying was government rhetoric of it and what the Home Office actually needed to deliver.
But also about what they will face.
No, I was just adding context to that, because
Yeah.
I had these conversations with him. But there was a message from government and the reality of what we were trying to deliver on site.
Sure, but part of the induction process which they were suggesting should be introduced should be to spell out the difficulties in what the realities that DCOs would have to face.
Yeah.
Sanctions for behaviour, having personal officers, for instance, having what he called 360-degree assessments with staff. Talked about changing the physical appearance of Brookhouse, including more artwork and so on, more sound absorbent materials in particular, and ways of reducing violence. And particularly talked about a three-way dynamic of violence, about aggression between detained persons, aggression against staff, and then the aggression from staff to detained persons. This was all offered pro bono at the start, I understand, with the Jill Dando Institute, because of the suggestion that a commercial contract should be entered into if it was to continue. We can't see what happened after May 2018. What, if anything, of those recommendations were taken forward?
A lot of the recommendations were already in train, I think, as we described on that. We didn't have a specific action plan towards it. It was something that I wanted to continue to engage with, and I'm saying that personally. At that point in time, we'd just appointed for a full-time director on site. I think, as you're aware, I was only initially supposed to go there for 6 months. The Home Office wouldn't allow us to advertise for another director at that time, so my period of duty there was extended. We engaged, and at the time in May, we then had approval to advertise. My engagement with Nick and Richard was to continue. The decision was made not to continue at that point until the new director arrived, to ensure they wanted the same outcomes in terms of relationships with a third-party provider that I did.
So what happened with the Jill Dando Institute? Was it taken forward?
It wasn't taken forward, no.
And why was that?
I think I've just explained it, because there was, even though that it was something that I was passionate about, my line management wanted to ensure that the new director it would be their choice in terms of what relationships with third-party providers that they would have going forward.
And do you know why the new director didn't take this up?
A lot of the changes that we discuss in here were implemented as a consequence of some of the support and guidance provided by Nick and Professor Richard Oatley were included. As a consequence of that, the improvements at Brookhouse were recognised then by the Home Office, and I think, as you're aware, we then negotiated a 2-year extension of the contract. That 2-year extension had included a number of them recommendations, not all, but the competing priority against having another action plan, and this is the discussion I had within my own organisation, another competing action plan when we still hadn't had signed off, and we still haven't had signed off, the Brookhouse action plan. I'd submitted numerous occasions, but I would imagine until this inquiry is complete, it would never get signed off. But we'd submitted that in May 18 as a draft closure action plan. A lot of the recommendations that I put into there were then accepted by the Home Office as part of the contract extension, and were then embraced by the Home Office for their recompete of Brookhouse, which was because we'd influenced then, based on our own learning, based on some guidance from other stakeholders such as Nick and the UCL.
I'm just going to interrupt you there, just for time.
But that did, what I was going to say, that influenced the contract, the Serco are now managing on site, because we suggested what that baseline staffing level, etc., should look like.
So which of those points were taken forward then? You said that there were some of those points that were already being taken forward and that they did in fact taken forward. So in terms of recruitment campaigns, personal officers, 360 assessment of staff, the issues with violence.
Yes, so the recruitment campaign, as you're aware, it's in terms of the 360 was more. The only 360s that would occur were actually with the senior managers. Staff was just on a general, normal appraisal system. In terms of personal officers, that was quite difficult, albeit we then tried to stop cross-deploying staff from unit to unit. There was continuity on the residential units. So there was part learning from them recommendations, albeit not a full introduction of a personal officer.
Chair, I note the time. I just have one short topic. I was going to propose that we sit just for another 10 minutes and hopefully that will finish this witness and perhaps have a 45-minute lunch.
I think that's fine. Thank you, Ms Townsend. Yeah, thank you.
Ms Tanford, you've said in your witness statement, you've set out some of the measures that were that you introduced after Panorama in order to try and ameliorate some of the problems that we saw. One of those was increasing staff and reducing hours. And you've said in your witness statement how that was done, that you engaged the trade union, and that in fact ended up being done, that you increased the number of DCMs, in particular because there was an issue about peers managing each other. So there was a proper, as you say...
Which I alluded to earlier, yes.
Yes, exactly.
Peers managing, I said which I alluded to earlier, sorry.
And you also said that you needed an aggressive recruitment campaign, and this included providing additional staff by an organisation called Corndell's, a Corndell apprenticeship. If I can just bring up on screen, please, IMB 000156. That's page 14 to 15. This is the 2018 IMB report. It's page 14, please. See right at the bottom there, 7.7, staffing and shortages. Staffing levels remained an issue throughout 2018. Staff shortages resulted in a failure to provide a full range of purposeful activities for detainees and, in some cases, missed hospital appointments. From the board's own observations, more staff generally means more meaningful interaction with detainees, more time to assist with their issues and general improvement of atmosphere in the centre. Also means less stress on staff. So would you agree that the recruiting targets weren't met?
I would suggest that the recruitment targets were, as I described, there was an aggressive recruitment campaign. So when I arrived there, September 17, which gives us a very short period left of 17. Even though we didn't have sufficient numbers of staff, full-time equivalent staff employed, we introduced contracted hour schemes, etc., to ensure that we could offer the regime as per the contract. I was quite surprised, in fact, that staff did volunteer, because the staff were bruised, significantly bruised, after Panorama. However, the solidarity amongst them to work together to ensure the detainees in our care had what we could had daily, what we could offer them. They volunteered to work additional hours. They were contracting on a weekly basis for up to 3 months to work an additional.
Ms Alvin, my question
hours.
wasn't about.
Well,
it was about recruitment.
Yeah. So I'll come back to that. So at the same time, we were having a very aggressive recruitment campaign. Aligned to that, I wanted to increase the number of DCMs on the units. So that was also having an impact. My target initially was to recruit 100 staff by April, which would have taken us into April 2018. Then aligned to that, some of the staff would be promoted, etc. So there was there was a significant drive in that recruitment. We were successful in that recruitment, and it had also where we'd been hemorrhaging staff previously to high levels of staff attrition. I can finish on this part. Where we were experiencing high levels of staff attrition previously, the engagement that you just alluded to in relation to our engagement with trade unions, etc., to reduce their hours from 46 to 40 whilst maintaining their same salary, actually did reduce the high levels of attrition that we've been facing. So we were making very good, very positive strides in the direction of this. And as a consequence of that, the evidence of this, forgive me for going on, the evidence that supports that is the Home Office then extended our contract by two years because they were aware of the investment we were putting into frontline staff.
But the IMP said in 2018 that staffing levels remained.
I acknowledge, and that's why I've just described what actions we were taking, because it takes quite a long time to recruit people, get their clearances, train them, and then deploy them. So, and I agree entirely in that. I think that is adding the support to why we as an organisation understood what the issues were and what we were doing to address it.
Finally, I want to ask you about mental health training, because that was another aspect which you say you worked on at Post Panorama. You said that the continuing absence of mental health, there is a continuing absence of mental health training, the IMB said this, there was a continuing absence of mental health training, and that there were plans to introduce a day's awareness training for existing staff, but there will need to be a feedback of trials. I'm sorry, that was you that you said that rather, it was an IMB meeting, thank you, from December 2017. Why do you say there was a continuing aspect of absence of mental health training? Was that something that you did initially as soon as you came in September 2017, or was that something that was introduced later on?
And I think it's still an evolving picture today. And I don't necessarily look at Brookhouse or Gatwick IRCs or wider across the whole sector. We're all learning in society about mental health, and it's an evolving picture. The initial ITC training for staff relating to mental health was a bit of it was a segue really into ACDT management, etc. And it was apparent from initial reviews that the mental health awareness training that we needed to deliver was generally to look at individuals looking at themselves, their health and their own stress management within the workplace. Because if you don't get your own mental health right, how are you going to care for others? So when I reviewed our training, it didn't look at yourself prior to ensure that you're able, in a good place yourself, to engage with others and support. Then it was trying to educate staff that people raising mental health issues, there's no stigma towards that. There should be no discrimination, etc. It was about trying to encourage staff to be more open in terms of mental health relationships. Then understanding by looking at self and realising how they can relate with others, and we were looking at depression, and then bringing it back into the workplace in terms of looking through the lens of those in our care. And it was apparent that the training that we had wasn't covering that, hence why we engaged them with third-party providers to see what was, because we didn't have the subject matter experts. And I know this is, again, not, we weren't training people into mental health workers. It was just an awareness of mental health concerns of self, and then when you understand from self is how you support others.
Could I just bring one final document, please, up on screen? It's the same document. It's the IMB report. It's page 18, please. And it's the last paragraph of that section on mental health. In the past, the board has strongly advocated enhanced mental health training for staff who frequently have to deal with detainees suffering such problems. While appreciating it has always been a part of the initial basic training for new officers, the IMB is aware that DCOs often feel underskilled when dealing with acutely ill men. We were told by G4S that it has not happened due to the need to prioritise training for new recruits in 2017, but we continue to recommend that there be enhanced training. So at that point in 2018, there hadn't been enhanced training, that hadn't been prioritised by G4S.
I had. As part of the Brookhouse Action Plan, we'd engaged with a mental health first aid provider, and that had commenced.
So
And
the
I'm
IMB
hoping-
wrong?
I'm assuming Dan Houghton is being interviewed over the next few days.
He will.
Dan was leading on this, and Dan will give further clarification than what I can.
So when they say we're told by G4S that it has not happened, that enhanced mental health training, is that incorrect?
I disagree with that statement, but if that Dan, I'll be corrected if that. But when I was feeding back to the board in terms of where we were, what I was observing, all emails receiving, etc., and my engagement with people was that this was occurring. But Dan will confirm that.
Thank you, Mr. Hanford. I don't have any more questions, but if you wait there, the chair may have some for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Townsend. Mr Hanford, thank you. I have one question for you. You've talked about the reflection that took place following Panorama. I'd like to take you back a few years again and ask you a question about reflection. You talked about some of the challenges that you were concerned would prevent the ability to provide the care that you needed to in terms of the introduction of the new beds. So you talked about changes in the detention estate, the acceptance of more time served foreign national offender, in the system, and that some of the learned behaviours that came with those individuals, prison-learned behaviours, indeed. You also talked about the advent of spice and the problems that caused in the prison estate and then into the detention estate as well. And you talked about the longer duration of detention that people were experiencing. Looking back, knowing that and that the concerns that raised for you in terms of the pressure that there would be with extra beds in Brookhouse, should you have reflected on whether you needed to train your staff any differently in response to those changes?
In the wider context, I would say no. In terms of having the benefits of that retrospective lens, in terms of, I wouldn't say training the staff, about changing our processes, for example. If we'd realised there was going to be such an increase in time served foreign national offenders and behaviours that some of our staff may not have experienced when we were only looking after 5%, even investing in things such as searching equipment. I've seen in John Collier's statement where he suggests that we should make use of the boss chair, etc. He's looking at it from a prison lens, but the IRC estate hadn't caught up with that at that point, albeit we ended up looking after the same population. So I wouldn't necessarily say it was about training, but I think it was more of a holistic management approach in terms of taking some learning from the journey that the prison service have been on and making better use of in some ways, history repeated itself from some prison behaviours. But in terms of the staff, I think the staff were very well prepared. They are, the majority of the staff there, one of the most professional staff group that I've met. Their skill set and the relationships with the detainees was phenomenal.
Well, I don't know whether you will have heard any of the evidence that some former detention staff gave us, but some of them have told us that they didn't feel prepared. They didn't feel equipped to deal with those challenges.
I think that's more generic rather than the increase in population, and I understand that. And one of the and we were having the similar feedback from the staff post Panorama as well, because what we then engaged with the Home Office was, when I joined the prison service in 1991, my first 2 weeks was at my local prison. Then I went off to college. I went off to college then understanding what a prison felt like, what a prison smelled like, what a prison looked like. We don't do that with our staff at the moment across the whole custodial estate. They sat there in a training room having some visual sort of demonstration through PowerPoint. Even role-playing is at its loosest end, and then they're expected to walk into the facility, and it is quite alarming for many of them. We were at the time trying to engage with the Home Office to give them an awareness of the centre during the training, so they could re-engage with the training officers in a comfortable environment, in a safe place, rather than amongst their peers when they go live. So I think there are lessons to be learned in terms of how we can support staff during the training.
Thank you very much, Ms Hanford. I have no other questions. Thank you, Ms Townsend. I know, my apologies to everybody that we're going to have a slightly shorter lunch, but we'll return at 2 o'clock.
Yes. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for giving your time this morning. I know you've been with us for a long morning, and it's not the easiest thing to do, but I do appreciate hearing your evidence.
Thank you.
Thank you.